Chapter 51, Part 1 of Ireland under the Tudors, Volume 3 by Richard Bagwell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Spaniards in Munster, 1601 to 1602. Cecil had been right in saying that no Spaniards would come in 1600, and he was equally well informed about their intentions in the next year. In the autumn he inclined to think that they would go to Galway rather than to any part of Munster, where the strength of the rebels had been so lately and so thoroughly broken. Limerick and Waterford were mentioned as probable objects of attack, but Carew thought an invader would avoid the former as giving no means of retreat, and the latter as being too easily reached from England. Cork he thought the most likely to attract them, especially as Florence MacCarthy had recommended it, and he set to work to remedy its natural weakness as far as possible. The other towns, he said, are neither worth their labours to gain, nor Her Majesty's charges to defend. The Spaniards did in fact aim at Cork, and may have been more easily turned aside by hearing that a warm reception awaited them there. Carew had in the meantime taken the precaution of arresting Florence and sending him to England. It may be doubted whether faith was not broken with him, but there can be no doubt of his dealings with Tyrone or with the Spaniards, and both the Queen and Cecil approved of his detention. Cecil warned Carew that the danger of invasion would not be over till the middle of October, and at the beginning of September Mountjoy thought it prudent to be ready for an immediate journey into Munster. On the 21st, both Deputy and President were Ormond's guests at Kilkenny, and on the next day an express came to say that the Spaniards had been sighted off the old head of Kinsale. Captain Love, in a small pinnace, and described them at sea off Cape Finisterre a fortnight before, had noted that they were full of soldiers and had made sail for Cork harbour to give the alarm. This says much for the superior sailing power of the English, but it is possible that the ships seen by Love were those which were driven into Corunna by bad weather. Lisbon had been the original point of departure. The main fleet, with Don Juan de Gila on board, arrived off Cork, but found the wind blowing out of the harbour's mouth and did not attempt an entrance. They had already passed Kinsale, to which port they returned, and on September 23 Don Juan disembarked all his men without opposition. The garrison, which was less than 100 strong, evacuated the town, most of the substantial inhabitants accompanying them with their goods, and the Spaniards marched in with 25 colours. The sovereign, with his white staff, saw them properly billeted, and it was noticed that he did it with more alacrity than if he had been providing quarters for the Queen's troops. On the news reaching Kilkenny, a council was held. Ormond and Wingfield advised the Lord Deputy to return to Dublin and prepare his forces, while the Lord President went to prepare supplies at Cork. But Carew urged Mountjoy to start at once for Munster, though with his page only. If the provincials, he said, saw the chief governor's back turned, they would think he lacked forces, and there would be a general revolt. The army, too, would make more haste when the general had gone before. These arguments prevailed, and when Mountjoy heard that Carew had provided supplies enough to support the whole army for 2 or 3 months, he rose from his chair and embraced him with many cordial words. Carew had 100 horse with him, and thus escorted, the two set out together next day. A night was passed with Lord Dunboyne at Kiltinnan, another at Clonmel, and third at Lord Roche's castle of Glanworth. After spending the one day at Cork, Mountjoy went with some horse to a point overlooking Kinsale, and found that most of the Spanish ships were gone. There had already been a little skirmish in the neighbourhood of the town, but no serious attempt could be made to disturb the strangers for nearly 3 weeks. Don Juan spent the interval in strengthening his position and in trying to make friends with the country people. In this he had very little success, for the weight of Carew's hand was still felt, and it was evident that the cloud which was gathering at Cork would soon burst. The Spaniards brought arms for the country people, but very few of them came in, and they were ordered by Mountjoy to drive all their cattle to the eastward of the Carrigaline River. The corn for 5 miles round Kinsale was burned, and the inhabitants were warned by proclamation not to take part with the Pope and the King of Spain, who were unjustly maintaining rebels against their anointed sovereign. Among those who accompanied Don Juan was Matthew of Devedo, a Spanish Franciscan who had been papal commissary with Desmond 20 years before, and who was now titular Archbishop of Dublin, and he was probably the author of the Latin counter-proclamation. In this document the deposing power is claimed for the Pope, and exercised by Pius V, Gregory XIII, and Clement VIII is treated as conclusive. Elizabeth being thus made a mere usurping heretic, the Irish are absolved from all allegiance to her and are ordered to support the Catholic cause on pain of being considered heretics themselves. In his own name the Archbishop wrote to O'Neill and O'Donnell, and Don Juan sent more than one messenger to hasten their coming. The Spaniards were without cavalry, having been given to understand that horses would be provided for the 1,600 saddles which they brought with them. Finding no allies, they had thus no means of acting on the offensive, and the English horse rode up to the very gates of Kinsale. The townsfolk were encouraged to withdraw their families and property, and were allowed to come and go until October 8, without any imputation of treason. Don Juan gave them equal liberty, and this increased his chance of a successful defence, for he had had about 4,000 men, and there were only about 200 houses in the town. Lord Barry went to Galbally with such forces as he could collect in the hope of intercepting Tyrone on his march southwards, and Mountjoy made such haste as was possible to be at Kinsale before him. On October 16 Mountjoy marched out of Cork, encamping on the first night at the Carrigaline River, and on the second under Knockrobin, a hill close to Kinsale. 10 days were spent in the wet fields without the means to entrench, for it was thought that longer delay would have a bad moral effect. At last these ships with guns and tools came to Cork, and were sent round to Oyster Haven, where there was no difficulty in unlading them. Don Juan had garrisoned Castle Park on the west side of Kinsale harbour, probably in the vain hope of preventing the entry of English vessels. He had another outpost at Rincurn on the east side, but neither work gave serious annoyance to the army, which was now entrenched on the Spittal Hill to the north side of the town. Carew found the artillery in very bad order, but the delay was of no service to the Spaniards, whose boats were effectually kept off by Captain Button in his pinnace. At last 2 pieces opened on Rincurn, but within 2 or 3 shot the carriage of the better Culverin brake, and about 2 o'clock in the afternoon the other received a flaw. The rest of the day was occupied in mending the carriage of the sound gun, and Don Juan tried to make a diversion by dragging artillery out of the town and firing into the camp. 2 men were killed near the Lord Deputy's tent, and 2 hogsheads of his beer broached, but no serious harm was done. In the morning the culverin began to play, and about 9 of the clock the demi-culverin was mounted, which after a few shot brake her axletree. Before 3 she was remounted, and by that time a cannon likewise planted, and all 3 pieces without intermission played. But Carew thought the fire too vague, and having obtained Mountjoy's leave, he laid the guns himself, so that the fire might converge on one spot. The true range was got with a quadrant, and the cannonade was thus continued after sunset. Another attempt was made to relieve the post by land, but this was frustrated with loss to the besieged, and by 6 o'clock the Spaniards in the castle called for a parley. They offered to surrender the fort on condition of being allowed to depart with arms and baggage. This was refused, and further parley declined, and the battery continued until 2 in the morning, when many of the besieged attempted to escape by the waterside. 23 Spaniards were taken and 30 killed. Of the Irish, all the fighting men escaped, but churls, women, and children were taken. The captain in command had his leg broken, and his subaltern, Don Bartolomeo Paez de Clavillo, was forced to surrender next morning, being allowed to carry out his own sword and give it up to Carew in person. He was quite ready to blow up the fort with himself and all his men in it, but the 86 surviving soldiers threatened to throw him over the walls. The lives of the Spaniards were spared, and they were sent to Cork, but no terms had been granted to the Irish, of whom Dermot McCarthy, called Don Dermutio, was the only person of note. He had been in Florence's service, had lived in Spain as a pensioner, and was able to disclose many important secrets. He was, however, afterwards hanged at Cork. A few days after the first success, Thomond arrived from England with 1,000 foot and 100 horse, after having been blown far to the westward and forced to take refuge in Castle Haven. Both men and horses were worn out by the long confinement on board, and had to be sent to Cork to recruit. About the same time Sir Richard Leveson arrived with his squadron and 2,000 soldiers, and the ships were warped into harbour in spite of the wind. Neither guns nor men were now wanting, and the siege began in earnest. The camp had already been fortified on the north side, so as to prevent an attack by Tyrone forces, which were daily expected, and Castle Park on the south side of the harbour was taken, after 2 ineffectual attempts. After a long cannonade, the Spaniards, who were but 17 in number, surrendered, and it is hard to see how so small a garrison could ever have been expected to maintain itself. The fact probably was that Don Juan expected to find an Irish army to help him, and that he found an English one instead. Mountjoy's camp was thoroughly fortified, and his approaches almost completed before any relieving force appeared. O'Donnell had, however, been long on his way. On hearing of the Spanish descent, he at once raised the siege of Donegal, and, accompanied by Brian O'Rourke and MacDermot and others, including some Munster exiles, marched from Ballymote through Roscommon and Galway to Shannon Harbour, where he was ferried across, and through Westmeath and King's County into Tipperary. At Meldrum and Meagher's country, between Roscrea and Templemore, he lay for 3 weeks, waiting for Tyrone, and the annalists observed with apparent pride that his people continued plundering, burning, and ravaging the country around them, so that there was no want of anything necessary for an army in his camp for any period, short or long. The Irish and Catholic hero knew no better way to advance the cause than by harrying people who were as Irish and as Catholic as himself. A council of war decided to send Carew to Tipperary in the hope of intercepting O'Donnell before his junction with Tyrone. Carew obeyed, though he considered the expedition useless. Having the goodwill of the country, O'Donnell was sure to have news of his coming, and against such a light-footed enemy he expected to have no better success than Ormond had with Tyrone. He left the camp on November 7 with 1,000 foot and 250 horse, and was afterwards joined by Sir Christopher St. Lawrence's regiment and by the irregular forces under Lord Barry's command. On arriving at Ardmale on the Suir, he found that there was no possibility of attacking O'Donnell among the bogs and woods, but supposed that the latter would hardly be able to go by without fighting, for the mountains of Slieve Felham, which in a summer offered a road into Limerick, were impassable from the rain. A great and sudden frost disconcerted these plans, and O'Donnell made a night march of over 20 Irish miles on hard ground. More than 200 years later, Lord Anglesey had personal experience of a winter's ride over these hills, and his sufferings resulted in the road which still bears his name. Carew hastened to intercept O'Donnell on his descent into Limerick, but found that he had already passed. To follow him into the wilds of Cornello would be to court disaster, and there was nothing for it but to return to Kinsale. Meanwhile the siege went slowly on, Mountjoy having an excellent engineer officer in Captain Josiah Bodley, whose elder brother founded the great Oxford Library. 6 guns were mounted in the trenches, and Sir Richard Levison's ships directed their fire upon the lower town. The Spaniards made frequent sallies, which were always repulsed, and they were unable to prevent the erection of more batteries. About 20 guns altogether were placed in position, and great execution was done both upon the Spaniards and upon their works. Being summoned to surrender, Don Juan said he would hold it against all enemies, first for Christ and then for the King of Spain, and on December 2 he made his great effort. 2,000 men sallied forth about 8 o'clock at night and attacked the trenches with great determination. In the darkness and rain they succeeded at first, but reinforcements came up fast, and they were beaten back with a loss of 200 men killed and as many wounded. They spiked 1 gun, but this was afterwards made serviceable, and it was now evident that the garrison could do nothing unless they were relieved by Tyrone or by reinforcements from Spain. Next day there was a report, which turned out to be true, that more Spaniards had come to Castlehaven. 12 ships had sailed from Runna, and of these only 6 reached Ireland, and finding the Queen's ships at Kinsale harbour, they did not venture to put in there. About 700 men were landed, and with these O'Donnell effected a junction. Sir Richard Levison went round with 4 men of war and 2 tenders, and the roar of his guns was heard in Mountjoy's camp. The result was that only 1 Spanish ship escaped. The rest were sunk or driven ashore. 5 guns had, however, been landed, and some 300 rounds were fired at the admiral, who was windbound for 24 hours. At last he warped his ship out with boats and returned to Kinsale. Early in November Tyrone began his southward march. He plundered the western part of the Pale and made his way slowly to the Bandon River, which then flowed through dense woods. O'Donnell, said Fenton, and Tyrone, following after, used all the means they could to work the Irish royalists to their side, but have reduced none of reckoning for anything yet discovered, only they both made havoc of some countries as a revenge to the loyalists that refused to rise with them. At the news of Tyrone's approach, Mountjoy completed the investment of Kinsale by erecting a small work to the west side of the town. Next day the Irish horse showed themselves within 2 miles, and on the day after that Levison's squadron again entered the harbour. The camp was strengthened against an attack from the land side, and the Spaniards made several fruitless attempts to interrupt the work by sallies. Cooped up within narrow limits and subsisting wholly on biscuit, the invaders suffered terribly by the almost incessant cannonade, and Don Juan grew anxious. In a letter which was intercepted, he besought Tyrone and O'Donnell to relieve him. The besiegers, he said, were wearied by their labours in the wet fields, and were unable to man a third part of the trenches. The assailants, who should be well seconded on his side, were sure to succeed, and being once mingled with the enemies, their forts will do them as much harm as us. The only allies gained by Tyrone in Munster were in West Cork and Kerry, and they did not declare themselves until the Spanish reinforcements arrived at Castlehaven. Castlemaine held out for the Queen, but Thomas Fitzmaurice, Baron of Lixnaw, came with O'Donnell from the north and recovered the castle, which gave him his title and 2 others. O'Connor Carey surprised his own castle of Carrick-a-Foyle and killed the guard, which consisted only of a sergeant and 12 men. Sir Fineen O'Driscoll, who never in the course of his whole life had been tainted with the least spot of disloyalty, gave up his castles at Baltimore to Spaniards, and O'Sullivan Bear did the same with Dunboy. Most of the O'Sullivans and McCarthys were engaged, but Sir Cormac Macdermot, Lord of Muskerry, remained with Mountjoy, who took care to employ him as to attract Don Juan's attention. Sir Cormac had, however, an understanding with the Spanish general, and promised him to deliver up the Lord President, alive or dead. Carew knew all about it, but ate, drank, rode, and conferred privately with this dangerous ally, whose design, perhaps, was only to make himself safe in case the Spaniards should triumph in the end, or in case he should fall into their hands. Tyrone had with him MacMahon, Maguire, Randall, McSorley, MacDonald, and some of the O'Connors and Burkes, but his chief dependence was upon Captain Richard Tyrrell and his mercenaries. Placed between two fires, Mountjoy's position was critical enough, and Tyrone's plan was to blockade him. On December 21, the Irish, with whom were a small body of Spaniards, showed themselves in force to the east of the camp, and they had complete possession of the country between the Bandon and Carrigaline rivers. The line of communication for supplies was thus cut off, no forage could be obtained, and it was decided by a council of war on December 23 that the horse should be sent away to Cork. The situation was indeed not unlike that of Cromwell before Dunbar, the English having the command of the sea and the enemy that of the land. If no battle had been offered him, Mountjoy might have been forced to abandon the siege. The Spaniards made sallies every night, and Don Juan, some of whose letters were intercepted, urged Tyrone to attack the camp. According to the annalists, he wished to pursue the Fabian tactics which had so often succeeded, but was overruled by O'Donnell, who was oppressed at heart and ashamed to hear the complaint and distress of the Spaniards without relieving them. The attack might have been successful had there not been treachery in the Irish camp. Brian McHugh Oge MacMahon, who was one of Tyrone's chief officers, had a son who had been Carew's page, and this gave an excuse for some friendly intercourse. A bottle of whisky was sought and given for old acquaintance' sake, and when thanking Carew for his civility, MacMahon found means to disclose Tyrone's plans. Thus warned, Mountjoy doubled the guards, and had all the soldiers ready to fall in at short notice. A flying column of about 1,000 men was kept under arms, and at daybreak on December 24 the enemy's lighted matches were seen in great numbers towards the northwest. It had been arranged that the camp should be attacked at midnight, and that the besieged should make a sally upon the trenches at the same time. Forewarned as he was, Mountjoy might have found it hard to resist such a combined onset, but there were other reasons for the failure of his assailants. The chiefs, say the Irish annalists, were at variance, each of them contending that he himself should go foremost in the night's attack, so that they set out from their camp in 3 strong battalions, shoulder to shoulder, and elbow to elbow. O'Neill with the Kinnell Owen and others were in a strong battalion apart. O'Donnell with the Kinnell Connell, his sub-chieftains, and the Connaught men in general, formed the 2nd battalion. Those gentlemen of Munster, Leinster, and Meath, with their forces who had risen up in confederacy of the Irish War, and who had been in banishment in Ulster during the preceding part of his year, were in the 3rd. Misled by his guides, O'Donnell wandered about all night, and when morning broke, Tyrone with O'Sullivan and the Spaniards found themselves close to the English lines and unsupported. End of Chapter 51, Part 1. Chapter 51, Part 2 of Ireland under the Tudors, Volume 3 by Richard Bagwell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Spaniards in Munster, 1601 to 1602. It is very difficult to understand the plan of attack. Mountjoy's information was to the effect that the Castlehaven Spaniards, with 800 Irish under Tyrrell, intended to throw themselves into the town, join the garrison, and renew the combined attack on the following night with every chance of success. What really happened was that the Irish fell into confusion on finding themselves suddenly faced by a well-prepared enemy. Intending a surprise, they were surprised themselves. Tyrone drew off his horse to reform them, and the foot, supposing him to be flying, began to waver on all sides. O'Donnell came up at this time, but all the endeavours of the chiefs were vain, for the ground was flat and open, and there was no scope for O'Neill's tactics. Seeing the enemy in disarray, though still unbroken, Wingfield obtained leave to act on the offensive, and Clanricarde importuned him not to lose this chance. Tyrrell and the Spaniards stood firm, and the English horse passed between them and Tyrone's main body. A small bog had to be passed, but the troopers struggled through it, and but little resistance was offered. All, says O'Sullivan, were seized with panic terror, or rather routed by divine vengeance. The Spaniards, who were less fleet of foot than their allies, made a stand and about the ruins of an old castle, but were cut to pieces. Their leader, Alonso de Campo, was taken and 5 other officers killed. The Irish lost something like 2,000 men, while on the English side there was but 1 fatal casualty. The Earl of Clanricarde, says Mountjoy, had many fair escapes, being shot through his garments, and no man did bloody his sword more than his lordship that day, and would not suffer any man to take any of the Irish prisoners, but bid them kill the rebels. He dispatched a score at least with his own hand, and the Lord Deputy knighted him on the field among the dead bodies, some of which were probably those of his kinsmen. The pursuit continued for 2 miles, and the slaughter must have been much greater, but that the half-starved horses could go no farther. The whole army was paraded, and public thanksgiving was offered for the victory. Indeed, both sides spoke of special interposition of Providence, and old prophecies were remembered or invented to suit the occasion. Greatly dejected, Tyrone withdrew to Inishannon, and no further attempt was made to relieve Kinsale. There prevailed, say the annalists, much reproach, moaning and dejection, melancholy and anguish in every quarter throughout the camp. They slept not soundly, and scarcely did they take any refreshment. Next day it was decided that O'Donnell and others should go to Spain, and that his brother Rory, with the rest of the Ulster chiefs, should go home, Tyrrell and some of the Burkes remaining in Munster under the general command of O'Sullivan Beer. With a shrewd knowledge of Irish politics, O'Donnell urged that the whole army should remain in the south until he could bring fresh reinforcements from Spain, for that those who had been affectionate had kind to them when advancing would plunder and mock them on their return. Tyrone was perhaps ready to renew the conflict in Munster, but the Celtic army broke up into its component parts, and each clan struggled northwards separately under its own chief. Their road was by Mallow, Croom, and Abington, and O'Donnell's words came true, for they which did kiss them in their going forward did both strip them and shoot bullets at them on their return, and for their arms they did drown them and tread them down in every bog and soft place. 200 perished in crossing the Blackwater, the Mague, and the Mulkeer. Horseflesh was their only food, the wearied animals sinking with the wounded who were left to their fate, or being killed by riders whom they could no longer carry. The principal chiefs were borne in litters, and Tyrone arrived quite unexpectedly in Cavan, where he killed a few cows for his exhausted followers. Not less than 3,000 men and 500 horses were believed to have been lost, besides all baggage, and the survivors were utterly demoralized. A troop of women, said Carew, might have beaten Tyrone's army. Bagwell's death was avenged, and his brother-in-law's military reputation destroyed. Irish writers lay the chief blame on Don Juan Aguila, and yet he does not seem to have been the real cause of failure. His constant sallies certainly betray no inactivity, and the failure of Tyrone to keep the appointed time is quite enough to account for his not making one at the critical moment. His was the common fate of every Spaniard who had attempted to attack Elizabeth within the bounds of her hereditary possessions. Spanish organization had become thoroughly bad, while that of the English improved daily. Mountjoy and Carew were good managers, but they were well seconded from home, and sometimes the Queen even anticipated their wants. She felt that her work would be incomplete if she left Ireland unsubdued, and the strength of her last years was ungrudgingly spent in that work. Don Juan saw that nothing could be made of the Irish alliance against such a queen and such devoted servants. It was clear that Kinsale could never be relieved but by fresh efforts in Spain, and he had seen what Irish storms and English sailors could do. The town would be taken by assault, and the accompanying carnage would be of no service either to king or pope. For 6 days after the battle, the siege operations were resumed, and the approaches brought very near the walls. On the 7th, Don Juan sent out his drum major and an officer bearing a letter. He asked that a confidential messenger might be sent into the town to confer with him, an officer of like rank being given as surety for his safe return. Sir William Godolphin was accordingly sent in, and Don Pedro Enriquez came out into the camp. Don Juan told Godolphin that he had found the Irish weak and barbarous, and he could not be sure that they were not perfidious. Mountjoy, on the contrary, he had found a sharp and powerful enemy, and on the whole he was ready to capitulate. If fair condition were not accorded, he would bury himself alive rather than yield. He professed not to be urged by necessity, but by a just disdain and spleen conceived against the Irish. Godolphin returned with this message, and on his second visit he was authorized to hold out hope of fair terms. Mountjoy took care to say that he had the game in his own hands, as indeed he had, but he was anxious to save blood and to show Her Majesty's clemency. Where both sides wished for peace, there could be little difficulty about arranging the terms. Don Juan declared that he felt himself absolved from all engagements to the Irish. His master had sent him to cooperate with the Condes O'Neill and O'Donnell, who had long delayed their coming, and when they did come they were shamefully defeated by a handful of men, and blown asunder into divers parts of the world. O'Neill had fled to Ulster, and O'Donnell to Spain. So as now he said, I find no such Condes in rerum natura, for those were the very words he used, as I came to join withal, and therefore have moved this accord the rather to disengage the king, my master, from assisting a people so unable in themselves that the whole burden of the war must lie upon him, and so perfidious as perhaps might be induced in requital of his favour at last to betray him. Both parties were eager for a settlement, for the loss by sickness had been great on the Queen's side, and the negotiations were short. Don Juan undertook to surrender not only Kinsale but also Castle Haven, Baltimore, and Dunboy. Mountjoy contracted for the safe conveyance of all the Spaniards and their allies into Spain, and for their villeting and good treatment during the necessary interval. The Spaniards were bound not to serve again against Queen Elizabeth until after they had been actually landed in Spain. More than 3,000 officers and soldiers were embarked under the terms of this convention, besides many priests and monks and a great company of Irish. The articles were signed on the 2nd of January. On the 3rd, Don Juan dined with Mountjoy, and on the 4th a Spanish ship appeared off Kinsale. A boat was sent out to say that the stranger might enter safely, for that Don John and the Lord Deputy were now very good friends. The Spanish captain hauled the boat's crew on board and at once made sail, and thus the first news of the surrender of Kinsale was carried to Spain about 5 weeks later. Another vessel with letters put into Bear Haven, and the packet was sent up by land to Don Juan, who with his principal officer had accompanied Mountjoy to Cork. Carew, with the latter's consent, had the messenger robbed on the road, but without hurting him. Don Juan's suspicions were aroused, and he was not satisfied with the explanation given, but a proclamation was issued offering a reward for the discovery of the thieves. Spanish dignity was saved, and Mountjoy kept the letters, which were of great importance. Large reinforcements were preparing in Spain, and the king wrote to say that he had heard of the defeat of Tyrone and O'Donnell, and that he nevertheless depended on Don Juan to maintain himself until help arrived. Details of the intended aid were given in other letters, and it was probable that, had the news come earlier, Kinsale would not have fallen, or at least would have had to be taken by storm. Carew had strongly urged that a golden bridge should be provided for a still formidable enemy, and the wisdom of this advice cannot be doubted. Baltimore and Castle Haven were soon taken. The Spaniards gave no trouble, but the O'Driscolls made some futile attempts at resistance, and at Barrett Haven the task was more serious. The Spaniards had increased the natural strength of Dunboy Castle by throwing up earthworks on which they had mounted 3 small cannon. On hearing of the capitulation they were ready to surrender, but O'Donnell O'Sullivan refused to be bound by the articles. Bringing 1,000 men quietly under the walls, he mastered the castle by surprise and forced the Spanish captain and some gunners to remain. The other Spaniards were sent to Baltimore, and preparations were made for a desperate resistance. O'Sullivan wrote an eloquent letter to Philip III as to his sovereign lord, in which he denied Don Juan's right to surrender his castle, which alone protected his property and the people living among 20 leagues of coast. He begged for help, and if help could not be given, then he asked that means might at least be provided to carry himself and his family to Spain. Don Juan sailed on March 16 at Cork. He lived familiarly with Carew and presented him with a book on fortification as a keepsake. The Irish in Spain brought so many charges against Don Juan that he was imprisoned, and he died soon afterwards under restraint. He lived long enough to bring many counter-charges, and as late as 1618 there was a wretched Spanish sergeant in prison at Ghent who believed that he owed his miseries to complaints made by Don Juan Aguila and of his conduct at Kinsale. The Spaniards were getting tired of war with England, in which they were nearly always worsted, and of alliances with the Irish, which had brought them nothing but loss. Don Juan made direct advances to Mountjoy, and Captain Roger Harvey, Carew's nephew, had a curious conversation at Baltimore with Don Pedro de Soto, an officer of high rank, who thought there was no real reason why England and Spain should be at war. King Philip said this candid Spaniard had indeed a great revenue, but in the infinite number of garrisons which he is daily forced to maintain, would devour another such Indies if he had them. If the Queen would only stand neutral in the Netherland quarrel, there might easily be peace between the two great nations. This conversation afterwards induced Carew to intrigue a little in Spain. Nothing came directly of it, but Don Pedro's feelings were perhaps those of many in the peninsula, and the way was paid for a change as soon as Elizabeth was gone. Excepting that of Londonderry, the siege of Kinsale is the most important in Irish history. Spain was to Elizabeth what the French monarchy was to William III. In both cases England headed the Protestant world against what threatened to become a European despotism. In both cases Ireland was used by the dominant Catholic power to create a diversion, and not for her own sake. The defeat of Tyrone and the subsequent surrender of Kinsale put an end to Spanish attempts on Ireland, as the breaking of the boom across the Foyle made French attempts virtually hopeless. In both cases it became evident that whoever ruled in London must necessarily be supreme upon both sides of St. George's Channel. Devoe, and even James II himself, had as little sympathy with the Irish as Juan d'Aguila. The official account of the Battle of Kinsale was sent over by Henry Danvers, and the Queen gave most gracious thanks to Mountjoy, as well as to Thomond and Clanricarde. But Carew contrived that the first news should be brought to London by his friend Boyle, whose activity and good fortune were shown in a remarkable way. "I left my Lord President," he said, "at Shandon Castle near Cork on Monday morning, about 2 o'clock, and the next day delivered my packet, and supped with the Sir Robert Cecil, being then principal secretary, at his house in the Strand, who after supper held me in discourse till 2 o'clock in the morning, and by 7 that morning called upon me to attend him to the court, where he presented me to Her Majesty in her bedchamber, who remembered me, calling me by name and giving me her hand to kiss, telling me that she was glad that I was a happy man to bring the first news of the glorious victory. And after Her Majesty had interrogated with me upon sundry questions very punctually, and that therein I gave her full satisfaction in every particular, she gave me again her hand to kiss, and commanded my dispatch for Ireland, and so dismissed me with grace in favour. Boyle does not say by what route he made the journey from Cork to London in such a wonderfully short time, but the place of landing was probably Bristol, with a south-west wind and a flood tide in Avon the feat is possible, but it is probably without a parallel. And great must have been the endurance of the man who, after galloping from Bristol to London, sat up talking till 2 in the morning, and was on his feet again at 7. The picture is a curious one, and it is interesting to note how this brilliant and successful man, writing more than 30 years afterwards, and in the fullness of wealth and honours, is careful to record that he twice kissed Queen Elizabeth's hand. The Queen was at first inclined to think the Spaniards had too easy terms, but declared herself satisfied when she had heard the whole story. The expense of the war and the waste of English blood was terrible, and she would not deprive even Tyrone of hope. He found means to make overtures very soon after the siege of Kinsale, and Cecil told Mountjoy privately that he did not think her inexorable, though the fear of being cajoled did not, as she wrote, permit her to hold any other way with the arch-traitor than the plain way of perdition. But the capitulation had been granted to save the blood of her subjects, dearer to her than revenge or glory, and the same consideration prevented her from driving Tyrone to desperation. In the meantime the army was to be reduced, and the rebellion extinguished in detail. Carew accompanied Mountjoy to Waterford and Kilkenny, whence he returned into Munster. The Lord Deputy went on to Dublin, where he lay inactive for some weeks, completely disabled by the hardships of the late siege. End of chapter 51, Part 2. Chapter 52, Part 1 of Ireland under the Tudors, Volume 3, by Richard Bagwell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The end of the reign, 1602 to 1603. Starvation by means of garrisons was Mountjoy's prescription for the Irish malady, and this treatment he pursued to the end. But he continued to dread Spanish intervention, for in common with most Englishmen of his time, he overestimated what was really a decaying and impoverished power. Cecil knew better, and throughout the spring and early summer of 1602 he continued to write in a rather contemptuous tone of Spanish intentions. In August he was able to say positively that there would be no invasion in force, though he could not promise that Philip would not send a few forlorn companies to keep up some sort of reputation in Europe, to put the Queen to cost, and to fill the world with continual rumour of his undertaking humour. To Carew he wrote in the same strain, and with still greater freedom. It was impossible to keep Spanish ships from Irish harbours, whereof there be more than the Queen hath ships, but the coast of Spain might be so harassed as to give them enough to do at home. Sir Richard Leveson was better employed taking carracks in the Tagus than he could be in Ireland, and between Hollanders and Englishmen the Catholic king was not likely to have many men to spare. But the Queen would not grudge the necessary outlay to make Cork, Kinsale, and some minor posts defensible. Thus encouraged, Mountjoy was free to attack Ulster, and he proceeded slowly but surely to draw the net round Tyrone. Dockwra was supposed to have between 3,000 and 4,000 men in Derry and Donegal, Chichester nearly 1,000 at Carrickfergus, and about 800 more were in Cal and in the garrisons at Mount Norris, Armagh, Blackwater, and Newry. Mountjoy had over 3,000 under his own command, and at the beginning of June he advanced to Dundalk. Dockwra had established a post at Omagh, and had no difficulty in joining the Lord Deputy at Dungannon, while Chichester ferried his contingent over Lough Neagh. Tyrone, who had laid Dungannon in ashes, was forced out of his country into the almost inaccessible wilds of Glenconkine, and his deserted strongholds were taken. In one, 3 guns were recovered, probably those taken at Blackwater. A new fort was built and manned at Mountjoy on Lough Neagh. Provisions falling short in July, Dockwra was sent back to collect in fiddle a force at Armagh, and which Chichester, who now had hopes of soon beheading that wood Kern Tyrone, could cooperate from his fortified post at Castletomb and Lough Neagh. Mountjoy retired towards Monaghan, taking all the small strengths in the direction, though not entirely without loss, from sharpshooters, and rode home to urge the positive necessity of keeping the garrisons on foot. Tyrone was now driven from place to place like a hunted hare, but if the efforts to run him down were allowed to relax, he would gain strength quickly, and all the work would have to be done over again. Tyrone was now begging earnestly for mercy, but the fate of Essex warned Mountjoy against meddling with so dangerous a person. The rebel would not come in upon his bare word, nor would he give that word. For to detain him afterwards would be dishonourable, while he might be blamed for letting him go. He could only urge that while Tyrone was lowest was the best time to bring him to terms. After much hesitation, the Queen was induced to promise him his life, but through Mountjoy only, and without divulging anything to the council. Cecil saw no reason why she should not publish it to all the world. If peace could only be dreamed of, he said, for saving of Christian blood, and of miseries of her natural people from hence hourly sent to the shambles. But her Majesty is the kingdom, and myself her humble vassal. Negotiations went on through the latter half of 1602, and in the meantime Mountjoy prosecuted the war. He gave out publicly that the Queen had resolved never to pardon Tyrone, but let him know that he himself might possibly become a suitor for him. That depended on how he behaved, and yet he wrote, "I've told him that I will cut his throat in the meantime if I can." Carew had nominally nearly 5,000 men to complete the reduction of Munster, but the real number was much less. Nearly half of the available force was sent under Thormond's command to ravage the country west of Kinsale and on both sides of Bantry Bay. Carew himself left Cork 6 weeks later and made his first halt on Tyrone's late camping ground near Carrickally. Nights were spent at Timoleague, Rosscarbery, and Castlehaven, and Baltimore was reached on the 5th day. In crossing the mountains between Skibbereen and Bantry Bay, slight resistance was made by some of the O'Driscolls and O'Sullivans, but Denmark was reached in safety on the 8th day from Cork. This place, called Carew Castle by the President, who was careful to note that it belonged to his ancestors and that the Irish name was derived from their title of Marquis. It is 2 miles to the north of Bantry, and was found a convenient place to collect the cattle and ponies of the neighbouring country, and O'Daly, whose ancestors had been hereditary bards of the old Carews, was here caught tampering with Owen O'Sullivan, and was sent for trial to Cork. The Spaniards in Dunboy were warned that they could expect no quarter if they remained there. If they left before the siege began, they would be sent safely to Spain, and Carew suggested that they might deserve greater favour by spiking the guns or disabling the carriages before they came away. No notice was taken of this message, and the army lay at Dunnamark until all was ready for the attack on Dunboy. Early in February, Carew sent Sir Charles Wilmot to carry with a force sufficient to overcome what remained of the rebellion there. Lixnaw Castle was taken, and Lord Fitzmaurice driven away into the mountains of Desmond. Carrick of Foyle was found deserted and partly dismantled. The Dingle Peninsula was thoroughly ransacked, and the castles all taken, and the Knight of Kerry driven into Desmond. The cattle in Everrock were also collected, and their owners forced into the woods in Glengariff. Wilmot's road to Bantry Bay lay by Mew Cross and Mangerton, a most hideous and uncouth mountain, and great preparations were made to attack him by the way. Carew moved up as far as Carricknass, and in the end the Irish showed no fight, though trees had been felled and breastworks erected at every point of vantage. the junction of the two forces was effected, and on the same day ships came from Cork. The army had provisions left for only 2 days, and would have been forced to retreat but for this seasonable aid. Dermot Moyle McCarthy, Florence's brother, had been in Ulster the year before, and Carew had then declared his intention to plague him on his return. He thought him both wiser and braver than Florence himself, and certainly more popular with the scattered swordsmen, half soldiers, half caterans, who still maintained the rebellion. Reduced to want by Carew and Wilmot, this chief took some cows belonging to McCarthy Rioch, and while fighting for their possession was killed by his own first cousin. To prevent his head from being exposed at Cork, as the President had threatened, the dead man was conveyed to Dimleague Abbey, and there buried by a friar with great solemnity. After this it was judged impossible to take a military train round by Glengarriff, and it was decided to cross Bantry Bay. Tyrrell seems to have understood that the game was up, and would have been ready to join Thomond, but the Jesuit archer prevented him, and he failed to come to the parley which he had himself asked for. The weather was very bad all this time, which the superstitious attributed to Archer's conjury, but Carew said he hoped soon to conjure his head into a halter, and yet he was not altogether incredulous himself. The country of Bear, he wrote, is full of witches. Between them and Archer, I do partly believe the devil hath been raised to serve their turn. Nevertheless, Thomond established himself in Bear Island by June 1, and here he had an interview with Richard MacGeoghegan, who held Dunboy for O'Sullivan. The Earl argued that the castle must fall, and urged the constable to gain credit by yielding it in time, while the latter tried to make out that the besiegers ran upon certain defeat, and could never even land in face of such strong fortifications. Neither persuaded the other, and Carew went on with his preparations. In spite of the witches, the army was transported into Bear Island without much difficulty. The sandy bay near Dunboy was found strongly fortified, and Carew resolved to make a false attack. The little island of Dinage was seized, and 2 guns mounted on it, the fire of which occupied the defenders of the works on shore. The main body was then quietly ferried across Bear Haven to a point westward of Dinage and close to Castletown. High ground hid the landing place from the castle, and when the stratagem was at last discovered, the Irish had to go round a deep creek. They found Carew's men ready for them, and were worsted in the skirmish which followed. Tyrrell was wounded. Archer narrowly escaped, leaving his missile behind him, as well as a servant, who was immediately executed. On the morrow a camp was pitched half a mile to the northeast. Next day the work of entrenching began, materials for gabions having to be brought from a wood nearly 2 miles away. The artillery was landed in full view of the castle without damage from its fire, but Carew did not begin to batter until the 11th day after landing. In the meantime the Irish had taken courage from the arrival of a Spanish vessel at Kilmallogue in Kenmare Bay. She brought 12,000 pounds, much ammunition, and letters urging the Irish chiefs to remain firm. But perhaps the most important part of the cargo was Owen McKeegan, bishop designate of Ross and vicar apostolic or nuncio, for he is called by both titles, who had absolute ecclesiastical authority over all Munster. He was able to impress the defenders of Dunboy with the idea that a great Spanish force would immediately come to their relief, and they imagined that they could hold out for 2 or 3 months. The Irish had built a small fort in the island of Dursey, which they intended for their last refuge. It was defended by 40 men and 3 pieces of Spanish artillery. Captain Bostock and Rowan O'Sullivan were sent by Carew with 160 men to reduce this remote stronghold. The water being tolerably smooth, the Queen's pinnace was brought up near enough to attack from the seaside, and the bulk of the men were landed in boats. The soldiers showed so much dash in assaulting the fort that the garrison came out and surrendered as soon as the outwork was forced. They were taken on to Carew's camp and all executed. Owen O'Sullivan recovered his wife, who had been O'Sullivan Bear's prisoner since February. In this out-of-the-way place, Bostock found no less than 500 milch cows, besides wheat and oil, and the existence of such islands goes far to explain the long resistance of West Munster. Nothing could be done against them without ships, and ships were very seldom available. Carew was a good artilleryman, as artillery was in his days, and he promised that Dunboy should fall within 7 days after he had opened fire. Others expected a longer siege, but he was much better than his word. The fire of 4 guns, concentrated upon the castle, made it untenable within 24 hours. Tyrrell's attempt upon the camp had been fruitless, and it was plain that there was no chance of relief. After 4 hours' fire, a turret fell in, burying many under its ruins. In another 4 hours, the west front of the castle collapsed, and dice were cast to decide who should lead the stormers. The post of honor and danger fell to Captain Doddington's company, and his lieutenant, Francis Curtin, was the first man to enter the breach. Curtin was wounded in 3 places, but he made good his ground, and Carew's colours were soon planted on a commanding point of the works. The besiegers still fought, but their guns were carried with a rush, and the whole place was now commanded. 40 men tried to escape by sea, but armed boats guarded that side, and they were killed. Among them was Mulligan O'More, the man who pulled Ormond off his horse when he was captured 2 years before. 77 men were left, and would have surrendered at sunset upon promise of life only, but this was denied, and the Jesuit Dominic O'Collan came out by himself. Next morning 26 more gave themselves up, including 2 Spaniards and 1 Italian, who were all that remained of the foreign gunners. McGeehan was mortally wounded, and Thomas Taylor, an Englishman's son but married to Tyrrell's niece, was chosen commander in his room. Taylor shut himself up in the vault with 9 barrels of powder, and with a lighted match in his hand swore to blow all up unless he and his companions were promised their lives. His men prevented this, and 48 surrendered at discretion. With him, when the English officers entered, they found MacGeoghegan still living, with a lighted candle in his hand. He staggered towards an open powder barrel, but Captain Power held him back, and the soldiers killed him. Of the 140 picked men who composed the garrison, not one escaped. The powder was then spent in blowing up the walls, and the castle, from which so much had been expected, was laid level with the ground. In this, as in every such Irish siege, the actual capture was comparatively easy. The real difficulty was to reach these distant strongholds and to maintain an army in the wilds. The garrison, champions of a lost cause and dupes of a feeble tyrant, deserved a better fate, but Carew showed no mercy. Of the survivors, 58 were at once hanged in pairs by the Earl of Thomond. 12 of Tyrrell's best men were respited for a time, but were also hanged when that leader declared that he would remain true to his master, the King of Spain. Taylor was taken to Cork and hanged in chains near the North Gate on the discovery that he had taken a principal part in King George Bingham's murder. O'Cullen, whom the English called Collins, was closely examined at Cork, and Catholic accounts say that he was tortured. He gave no useful information, but freely told the strange story of his own life. Born at Youghal and educated at a Jesuit school there, he went at the age of 17 to France, made some money as a waiter in inns, and served the League for 9 or 10 years under the Duke of Mercure. He rose to the rank of captain, and was recommended to the King of Spain by Don Juan d'Aguila, who was then in Brittany, coming under the influence of the Jesuit Thomas White of Clonmel, who was rector of the Irish Seminary at Salamanca. He was admitted after a time to the Society of Jesus, whose principles, we are told, he preferred to Dominican vigour or Franciscan rigour, but not to full priest's orders. And Archer, who knew him only by reputation, asked that he might accompany him to Ireland. His military knowledge was perhaps thought useful at Dunboy. After keeping him a prisoner for about 4 months, Carew found that nothing would be gained by preserving his life, and he was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Youghal, meeting his fate with the greatest courage and in a manner most edifying to his co-religionists. The fall of Dunboy prevented the King of Spain from sending prompt help, but he did not give up the idea. Rumours of fresh invasions were rife during the summer, and sooner or later O'Donnell might have returned with another army. That chief had sailed from Castlehaven immediately after the Battle of Kinsale, and fugitives from Munster continued to join him whenever opportunity offered. He landed at Corunna and went straight to the king at Zamora. Falling upon his knees, he obtained favourable replies to the 3 requests: that an army should be sent to Ireland, that the king, when he gained Ireland, would set no O'Donnell over him or his successors, and that he would never deny any right that the O'Donnells had ever had. Philip sent him back to Galicia, then under the government of his zealous friend, the Marquis of Carragena. Exiles are ever sanguine, and he professed to have no doubt of ultimate success, but Spanish vacillation sorely tried his impatient spirit. When the surrender of Kinsale became known in Spain, some vessels intended for Ireland were unloaded, and Don Juan's report was unfavourable. The disgrace of that unsuccessful commander revived O'Donnell's credit, and the ship which brought over Bishop McKeegan and his £12,000 was dispatched. O'Donnell began to despair of a great fleet, and begged to be allowed to go with a few small vessels. He asked his friends in Ireland to let him know the whole truth, but to keep bad news from the Spanish ears. This, of course, could not be done, and the arrival of Archer and a crowd of fugitives after the disaster at Dunboy must have outweighed all his arguments. He sought the king again at Simancas, and there he died after an illness of 17 days. His body was carried with great pomp to the royal palace at Valladolid and buried in the Franciscan monastery with every mark of respect. His solemn requiem was the death song of the Irish tribal system. Much romance cleaves to his name, but his ideas scarcely rose above those of an ordinary chief. Local supremacy was his main object, and the panegyric of the annalist fails to raise him to the height of a national hero. He was, they say, the vehement, vigorous, stern, and irresistible destroyer of his English and Irish opposers. He died at 30, but there is nothing to show that he would have even attempted the task of building a stable edifice with the shifting sands of Irish life. The Irish accounts do not suggest foul play, but Carew believed that O'Donnell had been poisoned by one James Blake of Galway, who had announced his intention of killing him. Blake was not hired by Carew, but he would hardly have made him his confidant if he had not expected reward, and it was he who brought the first news of O'Donnell's death to Munster. John Anise, who had been implicated in a plot to murder Elizabeth, had offered to kill Florence McCarthy, and afterwards gave out that he had been suborned by Cecil to poison that troublesome person. Cecil and Carew employed Anise as a spy, but denied that he had ever said anything about poison, and had him hanged out of the way as soon as he could be caught. Neither Blake nor Anise would have dared to speak of such things to a modern statesman, but the morality of that age was different. A similar suspicion attaches to the death of Hugh O'Donnell's brother, Rory, afterwards Earl of Tyrconnell. An Italian came to Sir Henry Wotton, who was then ambassador at Venice, and offered to kill Tyrone or Tyrconnell, but without mentioning their names or even seeming to know them correctly. Wotton said the earls were of no importance, having run away because they could do no harm at home. No doubt proclaimed rebels might be justly slain. Yet, he added, it was somewhat questionable whether it might be done honourably, your Majesty having not hitherto proceeded to the open proscription of them to destruction abroad. Neither was it a course so familiar and frequent with us as in other states. 3 months later, Tyrconnell and his page died rather mysteriously at Rome, others of his party also sickening. Roman fever was probably to blame, though Wotton seems to have half suspected poisoning, but in the interest of the papacy and not of the King of England. When O'Donnell sailed for Spain, he left his brother Rory in charge of the clan, who led them through all Munster and Connaught. The vast herds which Hugh had taken from his neighbours were found grazing peacefully in Sligo, and Ballymote was given up by O'Gallagher to the acting chief. Sir Neave was co-operating with Dockwra and kept his rival out of Donegal, but Roy allied himself with O'Connor Sligo and sought help from Brian O'Rourke against Sir Oliver Lambert, who was pressing him from the Connacht side. Tibbet Naylong and others of the lower Burks solicited Lambert's help, and he came up from Galway with a strong force, while O'Rourke fought for his own hand and refused to help O'Donnell. Lambert says he might easily have been stopped either at Ballina or Ballysadare, but he reached Sligo without serious fighting. The town had been burned by O'Connor, and the castle was in ruins. O'Donnell passed his cattle over the Curlers and across the Shannon into Leitrim. Lambert, though camping in places where no Christians have been since the war begun, could never catch him, but took 200 cows and a keg of Spanish powder. When the English were in Leitrim, and when Leitrim was invaded in turn, O'Donnell was safe in Roscommon, but Lambert established communications with his friends at Ballyshannon. The O'Malleys and O'Flahertys infested the coast, and Sir Oliver had to provide a galley with 50 mariners and 15 oars on a side. For these pirates spared no one, and Bingham found it necessary to take similar precautions. Lambert thought Sligo would be a dainty place for a gentleman if walled, and he placed a garrison there, which was able to maintain itself until the end of the war. The absence both of Tyrone and Hugh O'Donnell in Munster left a comparatively clear field to Sir Henry Dockwra, the county void and no powerful enemy to encounter withal, more than the rivers Castle, Derg, and Newtown, Stewart, both lately garrisoned, had since been betrayed by Turlough Macneillason, a follower of Sir Arthur O'Neill, who had become a favourite with the English officers. Turlough first carried his favour with Captain Atkinson at Newtown by helping him to seize some cattle. Having dined with his officer, he persuaded him to take a walk outside the castle. 3 or 4 Confederates suddenly appeared, who made the captain prisoner, while others got possession of the courtyard and of the hall door. The soldiers lying in the Irish thatched house were killed. Captain Dutton lost Castle Derg by a similar stratagem, but in the absence of the great chiefs, Dockwra was clearly the strongest man. O'Cahan's country was harried to punish his perfidy, and even women and children were killed. Donegal was victualled, and Ballyshannon, that long-desired place, taken and garrisoned. Turlough Macneillason's turn soon came. Countrymen in Dockwra's pay pursued him from place to place, and his followers were killed one by one without knowing their pursuers. Those who were taken, says Sir Henry, I caused the soldiers to hew in pieces with their swords. The hunted man travelled about the woods at night, sometimes occupying 3 or 4 cabins successively, and lighting fires to attract attention where he did not intend to stay. A boy was set to watch, and at last the poor wretch was seen to take off his trousers and lie down. 4 men, says Dockwra, with swords, targets, and Marians fell in upon him. He gat up his sword for all that, and gave such a gash in one of their targets as would seem incredible to be done with the arm of a man, but they dispatched him and brought me his head the next day, which was presently known to every boy in the army, and made a ludibrious spectacle to such as listed to behold it. Captain Dutton's betrayers had better luck. They had killed no one, and were twice spared by Dockwra, after swearing with the most profound execrations upon themselves if they continued not true. They broke out nevertheless, and the ringleaders kept the woods till Tyrone's submission, when they were pardoned by Mountjoy's express command. End of chapter 52, part 1. Chapter 52, part 2 of Ireland under the Tudors, volume 3 by Richard Bagwell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The end of the reign, 1602 to 1603. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1602, Dockwra and Chichester continued steadily to reduce small strongholds, to drive cattle, and to make a famine certain should Tyrone hold out till the spring. In August, Mountjoy again went northwards and planted a garrison at Augur, at Tullagog, says Morrison, where the O'Neills were of old custom created. He spent some 5 days, and there he spoiled the corn of all the country, and Tyrone's own corn, and brake down the chair where the O'Neills were wont to be created, being of stone planted in the open field. But he could not get within 12 miles of the rebel Earl himself, who had retreated into thick woods and at the lower end of Loch Earn, and who endeavoured to keep his friends together by letters in which he urged them to make no separate terms for themselves. If you do otherwise, he said, stand to the hazard yourselves, for you shall not have my consent thereunto. One transient gleam of success rewarded Rory O'Donnell and O'Connor Sligo in an attempt to force the passage of the Curlews from the Roscommon side. A panic seized the English soldiers, who may have remembered the fate of Sir Conyers Clifford, and they fled in confusion to Boyle, but without any great loss. It was in Munster that hopes of Spanish succour were strongest, but Carew was able to send troops and supplies to help Mountjoy, and at the same time to finish his own work. Sir Cormac MacDermot, the chief of Muskerry, whose intriguing nature was well known to Carew, was found to have received 800 ducats from Bishop Owen McKeegan, and to have placed Blarney Castle at the disposal of the Spaniards. Captain Roger Harvey was sent on pretence of hunting the buck to call at the castle and ask for wine and usqua bow, whereof Irish gentlemen are seldom disfurnished, and if possible to get possession of the place. But the warders were on their guard, and Harvey could not even get into the courtyard. Sir Cormac himself was at Cork, not having dared to refuse attendance at the assizes, and his wife and children were also secured. Finding himself in the lion's mouth, he ordered his people to surrender Blarney, while he made preparations for his own escape. After dark on the evening of Michaelmas Day, he got out of the window in his shirt, several gentlemen being outside to receive him. A passing English woman raised the alarm, but the runaway was befriended by town and country and got safe away over the walls, only to find that he could do nothing. His castle of Kilcrea had already surrendered, and Macroom was taken owing to an accidental fire which arose while the warders were singeing a pig. No Spaniards were visible, and Tyrrell, who had eaten up beer and Bantry, proposed to quarter his men in Muskerry. At last, towards the end of October, Sir Cormac came to Carew and sued for mercy on his knees. A protection was granted to him, for he was helpless without his castles. His eldest son was at Oxford, well watched, and Tyrrell had destroyed his corn. Raleigh advised Elizabeth not to pardon him, his country being worth her while to keep, and its situation being such as to leave him always at her mercy. Orders were accordingly given that his pardon should be withheld, at least until he had provided an estate for his cousin Teague MacCormac, who had first revealed his intrigues with the Spaniards. O'Sullivan Beer still maintained himself in Glengarriff, but his position had become hopeless. In December, Tyrrell gave up the contest and marched 80 miles without a halt from near Castle Island into the King's County, leaving all his carriages and impediments as they, tired, scattered to hazard. Wilmot then attacked O'Sullivan's position and succeeded after 6 hours' sharp fighting in driving off 2,000 cows, 4,000 sheep, and 1,000 hackneys. Sir John Shamrock's son, William Burke, refused to stay a moment longer, cursing himself for lingering in Munster and losing his brave followers. O'Sullivan was thus forced to fly, and on the night of the 3rd of January he slipped away with all his family and retinue. When Wilmot came to his late camping ground, he found only sick and wounded men, whose pains and lives by the soldiers were both determined. The fugitives had a sharp skirmish with Lord Barry near Liscarroll, but reached the Shannon at Portland on the 9th day, fighting all the way and not venturing to turn aside after cattle, although often very hungry. Finding no boats, they killed 12 horses, and Dermot O'Driscoll, who was used to the canoes or curraghs of the west coast fishermen, constructed one with osiers 26 feet long, 6 feet wide, 5 feet deep, and capable of holding 30 men. 11 horse skins were used to cover this ark, and the 12th was devoted to a round vessel planned by Daniel O'Malley and intended to carry 10 men. The O'Malleys were more given to the sea than even the O'Driscolls, but the round ferry boat sank while the long one answered its purpose. Ormond's sheriff of Tipperary failed to prevent O'Sullivan from crossing the great river, and he reached Aughrim on the 11th day from Glengarriff. Sir Thomas Burke, Clanrickarde's brother, who had the help of some English soldiers, attacked him where a superior force, but was worsted with loss after a hard fight in O'Kelly's country was passed on the same day. On the borders of Galway and Roscommon, MacDavid Burke showed the will but not the power to stop the fugitives who eluded pursuit by leaving great fires in the woods near Castlereagh. They suffered horribly from snow and rain. Their shoes were worn out, and their last horses furnished a scanty meal. O'Connor Carey's feet were a mass of sores, and he reproached those members for their cowardice, which was likely to imperil his head and his whole body. He struggled on with the rest, and in a wood near Boyle, Heaven, as the pious historian believed, provided them with a guide. A barefooted man in a linen garment and with a white headdress and carrying an iron-shod staff in his hand came to meet them. His appearance was such as to strike terror, but he told O'Sullivan that he had heard of his glorious victory at Aughrim, and was ready to lead him safely into O'Rourke's country. O'Sullivan, who was perhaps less credulous than his kinsman, secured the stranger's fidelity with 200 ducats, which he magnanimously accepted not as a reward, but as a sign of a grateful mind. He led them by stony ways to Knockvicar, near Boyle, where they bought food and dried themselves at fires. The blood upon O'Connor's blisters hardened with the heat, and he had to be carried by 4 men until they found a lean and blind old horse on whose sharp backbone the sufferer was rather balanced than laid. The curlews were safely passed, and at daybreak on the 16th day of their pilgrimage O'Rourke's castle of Leitrim was in sight of over 1,000 persons who started from Glengarriff, but 18 soldiers, 16 horse boys, and 1 woman reached the house of refuge. A few more afterwards straggled in, but the great bulk had died of wounds and exposure, or had strayed away from their leaders. I wonder, says the historian, how my father Dermot O'Sullivan, who was nearly 70, or how any woman was able to sustain labours which proved too much for the most muscular young men. The distance traversed was about 175 miles, as the crow flies. Like many chief governors before him, Mountjoy contemplated spending much time at Athlone, and the Queen approved of this. He went there in November 1602, and both Rory O'Donnell and O'Connor Sligo came to him there before Christmas. Rory called to mind the hereditary loyalty of his family since Henry VIII's days, adding that he himself had agreed with Sir Conyers Clifford to serve against his brother Hugh, and had been put in irons by him. O'Connor claimed to have brought in Rory, and to have suffered likewise for his fidelity to Clifford. His legs, he said, had never healed properly, being almost rotted with the irons. Tyrone lurked in Glenconkyne in very wretched case, whence he wrote in most humble terms, and, as he said, with a most penitent heart. Mountjoy had sent back his last letter because it contained no absolute submission. I know the Queen's merciful nature, he now said, though I am not worthy to crave for mercy. Without standing on any terms or conditions, I do hereby both simply and absolutely submit myself to her Majesty's mercy. Christopher St. Laurence conducted some negotiations on his own account, but the Lord Deputy earnestly repudiated any knowledge of these, and continued almost to the end to say that he might possibly intercede with the Queen, but would do nothing more. Elizabeth's instinct told her that Tyrone was no longer formidable, unless she set him up again, and this it is most probable she would have never done. A month to the letter last quoted, and barely 2 months before the Queen's death, Mountjoy talked of hunting the arch-traitor into the sea. He and Carew were together at Galway soon after Christmas, and it was agreed that the latter should go to England. Both of them wished to get away, but the Queen would not hear of the deputy quitting his post, nor would she let the President go without his superior's leave, and Cecil cleverly contrived that the suggestion should seem to come from Mountjoy himself. Never, we are told, was a virgin bride, after a lingering and desperate love, more longing for the celebration of her nuptial than was Carew to go to England, but he returned to Munster and made things quite safe there before he started. Now that Tyrrell and O'Sullivan were gone, he ventured to send to Athlone 500 men out of 700, which were all he had available, after providing for the garrisons and making allowances for the sick and missing. He feared that O'Sullivan might return, but of this there was no real danger. The war was now confined to a corner of Ulster, and if Elizabeth had lived, the fate of Tyrone might have been like that of Desmond. To run him down was, however, a matter of extreme difficulty, and he seems to have thought that he could get out of Ireland if the worst came to the worst. While Mountjoy was conferring with Carew at Galway, Dockwra and Chichester were pressing Tyrone hard. He was confined to about 200 square miles of glens and woods in the southeastern part of Londonderry and the easternmost corner of Tyrone, and his fighting men scarcely exceeded 50. His numerous cattle were on the inaccessible heights of Slieve Gallion, and he himself had several resting places surrounded with felled trees and protected by streams which were only fordable in dry weather. Dockwra came to Dungannon with 450 English foot and 50 horse, and with 200 O'Cahan and 100 Docherty Kern. Chichester had a fortified post at Tuam, where the band leaves Lough Neagh, and he gathered there all the forces that the Ulster garrison could spare. Letters between the two leaders, for the most part, miscarried, and it was found quite impossible to converge upon Tyrone. From the very entrance of the woods, the O'Cahans ran away to their own country, and the O'Dochertys pronounced the travelling impossible. The men sickened fast. One guide went off to Tyrone, and was followed by another, who first contrived that cattle coming to Dockwra's relief should be stolen. Chichester penetrated farther into the woods, and fought 2 skirmishes without doing much harm to his light-footed adversary. Dockwra returned to Derry 2 or 3 days after Christmas, and Chichester also abandoned the enterprise. The country about Tuam was eaten as bare as an English common, and things were rather worse at Derry, which was quite out of the course of trade, and equally deprived of local supplies. It was no better in the Pale, and the whole army, now reduced to a nominal 13,000, depended entirely upon victuals sent from England. Even Dublin feared famine, and every one was so worn out that it was difficult to get any service done. The confusion in the currency crippled trade and caused distress in the towns, but the winter war had worked a far greater mischief among the poor rebels in the country. Mountjoy had clearly foreseen a famine, and had done his best to bring it about, and had completely succeeded. Multitudes lay dead in the ditches of towns and other waste places, with their mouths all coloured green by eating nettles, docks, and all things they could rend up above ground. Sir Arthur Chichester saw children eating their mother's corpse. Captain Trevor found that certain old women lit fires in the woods and ate the children who came to warm themselves. Rebels received to mercy, killed troop horses by running needles into their throats, and then fought over the remains. Not only were horses eaten, but cats and dogs, hawks, kites, and other carrion birds. The very wolves were driven by starvation from the woods, and killed the enfeebled people. The dead lay unburied, or half-buried, for the survivors had not strength to dig deep, and dogs ate the mouldering remains. Some fled to France or Spain, but they were few compared to those who perished at home. Had Tyrone escaped from Ireland, he would have gone to Scotland, or perhaps only to the Scotch Islands. In 1597 he had offered his services to James, complaining of hard treatment at the hands of deputies, and apologizing for not having paid his respects sooner. While accepting these overtures and declaring himself ready to befriend him in all his honest and lawful affairs, the king, with characteristic caution, noted that the time had not come, when he wrote, "It shall please God to call our sister, the Queen of England, by death we will see no less than your promptitude and readiness upon our advertisement to do us service." Tyrone took care to be on good terms with the sons of Sorley, boy of Macdonald, to one of which Randall created Earl of Antrim in the next reign. He afterwards gave his daughter. A channel of communication with Scotland was thus always open, and it was certainly used on both sides. Early in 1600, Tyrone thanked James for his goodwill, and assured him that Bagwell's expedition was intended to end in the writer's extermination. This letter came into Cecil's hands, and no doubt he was constantly well informed. He had a Scotch spy, one Thomas Douglas, who also acted as a messenger between James, Tyrone, and Macdonald's, and who carried a letter from the Duke of Lennox to Ireland early in 1601. This did not prevent James from offering to help Elizabeth with Highlanders against Tyrone in the same year. The Queen thanked him heartily, but remarked that the rebels had done their worst already. It is plain that she saw through her good brother like glass. Remember, she once wrote to him, that who seeketh two strings to one bow may shoot strong but never straight. If you suppose that princes' causes be veiled so covertly that no intelligence may betray them, deceive not yourself. We old foxes can find shifts to save ourselves by others' malice, and come by knowledge of greatest secret, especially if it is touch our freehold. Tyrone had made an unconditional submission, so far as it was possible to make it by letter, but the Queen was very unwilling to pardon him or to grant him anything more than bare life. At the same time there was a disposition to press the matter of religious uniformity, and to revive the Ecclesiastical Commission, which had long lain dormant. Vice-Treasurer Carey was not content with the mischief done by the new coin, but must needs recommend a sharper way with recusants as a means of pacifying the country, and perhaps of filling official pockets. Mountjoy, whose great object was to end the war and get home, in effect told Carey that Satan was finding mischief for his idle hands in Dublin, while the army was half-starved, and the Lord Deputy himself likely to be reduced to salt-ling. If, he wrote from Trim, you did but walk up and down in the cold with us, you would not be so warm in your religion. Mountjoy had his way on this point, and nothing was done to frighten the Irish unnecessarily, or to drive the towns into Spanish alliances. He reminded Cecil that Philip II had lost the Netherlands by bringing in the Inquisition, and that the states who at one time held nearly all provinces had lost many of them by pressing the matter of religion too hotly. All religions, he said, grew by persecution, but good doctrines and example would work in time. In the meanwhile, he advised discreet handling as the only means of avoiding a new war, of which he said many would be glad, but God deliver us from it. At the beginning of March, Mountjoy received 2 letters from the Queen, written on February 6 and 17, and another from Cecil, written on the 18th. In the first of these dispatches, which were all delivered together, Elizabeth told her deputy to send for Tyrone on promise of life only, and to detain him. In the second, she authorized him to offer life, liberty, and pardon. And in the third, speaking through Cecil, she rather enlarged his powers, while laying some stress on altering the title of Tyrone, on reducing the size of his country, and on forcing him to keep the roads into it always open. There was no difficulty about the last covenant, for the felling of a few trees would always nullify it. But Mountjoy pointed out that O'Neill and not Tyrone was the dangerous word, and that it was great gain to have an earl by any name instead of a chieftain by that one. As to curtailing the repentant rebels' land, he thought that obedience would be more probable from one who would lose rather than gain by change. The great Queen was no more when the letter containing this reasoning was sent, so that we cannot tell whether she would have agreed to it or not. On the very day of her death, commission was given to Sir William Godolphin and Sir Garrett Moore to treat with Tyrone. and he and his adherents were protected for 3 weeks. Elizabeth died on March 24, and Mountjoy knew this on the 27th, but his secretary, the historian Morrison, had the address to prevent the news from being publicly known before April the 5th, and in the meantime Tyrone had made his submission. To save time under the extraordinary circumstances in which he was placed, Mountjoy sent Godolphin to tell Tyrone that the least hesitation would probably be fatal to him, and that his former delays had much incensed the Queen. Godolphin was not in the secret, but he felt that it was no time for ceremony, and in the belief that confidence would beget confidence, he rode several miles beyond Dungannon to meet Tyrone, who readily accompanied him to the fort at Charlemont. Next day the commissioners brought their prize early to Mellifont, where Mountjoy lodged. There, says the secretary who was present, Tyrone, being admitted to the Lord Deputy's chamber, kneeled at the door humbly on his knees for a long space, making his penitent submission to her Majesty, and after being required to come nearer to the Lord Deputy, performed the same ceremony in all humbleness the space of 1 hour or thereabouts. He had ever preferred the substance to the shadow, and his formal humility stood him in good stead. The written submission was equally complete, and contained not one word about liberty or of conscience, or in favour of that church as who championed the Pope had sent him to a crown. He renounced all dependence upon foreign principles, and especially upon Spain, abjured the name of O'Neill, abandoned all his claims over the lands of neighbouring chiefs, and agreed to accept such estates only as the Queen should grant him by patent. He promised to disclose all he knew about dealings with Spain, to bring his son back from thence, if possible, and in short to do everything that might become a faithful subject of the English crown. Mountjoy, in return, promised a royal pardon and a patent for nearly all the lands which he held before his rebellion. 300 acres were reserved for the fort of Mountjoy, and 300 for Charlemont, and Ulster was to submit to a composition as Connaught had done. On April 4, Tyrone reached Dublin with the viceregal party, and on the 5th Sir Henry Danvers arrived from England with official tidings of the great change. King James was at once proclaimed, and the people shouted for joy, but Tyrone, on whom all eyes were fixed, shed abundant tears, and he was fain to hint at a grief for the loss of the mistress whom he had been fighting for the last 10 years. There needed, says the observant secretary, no Oedipus to find out the true cause of his tears, for no doubt the most humble submission he made to the Queen he had so highly and proudly offended, much eclipsed the vainglory his actions might have carried if he had held out till her death. Besides that by his coming in, as it were, between two reigns, he lost a fair advantage, for by England's estate, for the present unsettled, to have subsisted longer in rebellion, if he had any such end, or at least an ample occasion of fastening great merit on the new king, if at first and of free will he had submitted to his mercy. During the last 4 years and a half of the Queen's reign, it was computed that the Irish war had cost her about £1,200,000, and this was an enormous demand upon the slender revenue of those days. The drain upon the lifeblood of England was also terrible. Droves of recruits were forced annually into the ranks to perish among the bogs and woods, while the most distinguished officers did not escape. The 3 Norrises, Clifford, Berg, Bagenal, and Brigham, died in Ireland, while Essex and Spencer were indirectly victims of the war there. The price was high, but it secured the conquest of Ireland. Lawyers in the next reign might ascribe the glory to James, but the hard work was all done ready to his hand, and it would not have been done at all had it been left to him. It was by Elizabeth that the power of the chiefs was broken, and until that was done, neither peaceable circuits nor commercial colonies were possible in Ireland. The method pursued was cruel, and the desired end was attained. It was easy to find fault, but none who love the greatness of England will withhold their admiration from the lonely woman who had repelled all attacks upon her realm, who broke the power of Spain, and who, though surrounded by conspirators and assassins, believed that she had a mission to accomplish, and in that faith held her proud neck unbent to the last. End of Chapter 52, Part 2. Chapter 53 of Ireland Under the Tudors, Volume 3, by Richard Bagwell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Elizabethan Ireland. The physical features of a country must always have great influence on its history. Plains naturally submit to strong and centralized government, while mountains tend to isolation and to the development of local liberties. Where races have warred for the possession of a country, the weaker has been often driven into some mountainous corner, which the conquerors have been contented to bridle by castles or fortified towns. But where mountains or other natural strongholds are scattered over the face of the land, the conditions of conquest are different. It has been noted that while no country is more easily overrun than Spain, none is more difficult to occupy permanently, and this was the case of Ireland. As long as the Anglo-Norman settlement retained its vigor, the natives were driven into the less fertile districts, while fortresses protected the good land. But as the policy of the Plantagenet kings gradually weakened the colony, the castles were deserted, and the native race resumed possession of the soil. Feudal law sought the protection of walled towns which were of Danish or Anglo-Norman origin, and those nobles who retained their power did so only upon condition of more or less perfectly assimilating themselves to Irish chiefs. When the Tudor reconquest began, it was seen that two courses were open to the crown. Englishmen were encouraged to settle, and a system of garrisons was gradually established. Sometimes the prevailing idea was to substitute English for Irish proprietors. At other times it was thought better to conciliate the native chiefs while taking such military precaution as might prevent them from preying upon the settlers. During the whole of the 16th century, statesmen did what they could to persuade the Irish chiefs to hold of the crown, and thus to become liable to forfeiture. Ireland has long been covered with a network of good roads, but a glance at any tolerable map will show how difficult it was to occupy before the roads were made. In clear weather, mountains are always visible, both to the crew of a circumnavigating ship and to the sportsman who seeks snipe or waterfowl in the central bogs. It is said that when the Ordnance Survey was made, fires first lit upon the Gaeltachts in Tipperary were answered by fires on a mountain in Cavan, and the great range of Slieve Bloom must be passed between those 2 points. Nor was it with mountains only that Elizabethan generals had to deal. Lord Grey is said to have introduced the first coach, but Ireland had no tolerable roads for long after his time. There were a few stone causeways, but great part of the island was covered with natural woods, and these could be crossed only by passes which the chiefs periodically agreed to cut, both for troops and for peaceful travellers. When war broke out, and the doors of Janus were seldom shut for long, these rudimentary roads were easily closed. A few trees were felled so as to prevent horse from passing at all. The branches of others were partially cut and skilfully interlaced, so that even infantry, while they struggled through the barrier, were exposed to the fire of an unseen enemy. Bridges were but few, and holes dug in the beds of rivers made the fords impassable, or at least very dangerous. When the Irish were hard pressed, they could retire to dry spots surrounded by bogs, and nearly every little lake contained a canogue where some oats had been stored, and which might be held until the assailants had exhausted their provisions. The little active cattle accompanied their light-footed masters, while the soldiers, whose clothes were seldom dry, perished miserably of dysentery and marsh fever. In the absence of field artillery, very rude earthworks might be long held and in any case they could be easily abandoned, while Tyrone made it a point of not defending castles which experience had shown to be untenable against cannon. Garrisons and garrisons only could starve out the guerrillas, and it was by their multiplication and maintenance that Mountjoy was enabled to accomplish Elizabeth's lifelong task. Ulster is on the whole very hilly, and it is easy to see how strong it must have been when the woods were still uncut, when there were practically no roads, and when drainage had not yet been thought of. The most still inaccessible forest was that of Glen Conkine about Draperstown in Londonderry, but the whole province was a stronghold, and a mere enumeration of woods and bogs would be useless. Connaught also is a land of mountains and bogs, and was once a land of woods. It was about the Curlews that the hardest fighting took place, and the northern part of Leitrim was very difficult to attack. In Leinster, Glenmalure was famous for a great disaster to the English arms, and was the chief stronghold of Fiach MacHugh O'Byrne. The oak wood of Shillelagh in Wicklow was a noted fastness, and from having given its name to a rustic weapon, it is of all the best remembered. Both kings' and queens' counties were full of woods and lurking places, the great bog called the Tacho near Maryborough being one of the most important. The Slieve Margie range between Monaster-Ravan and Carlow was the frequent resort of Rory O'More and of his son Owen MacRory, and the O'Byrnes were not very far off. Wexford had many bogs and woods, but the Kavanaghs and other turbulent clans were scarcely formidable towards the close of Elizabeth's reign, except during the general collapse of authority which followed the disaster of 1598. In Munster, what was generally called the Great Wood lay to the north of Mallow. Glengarriff was another great Cork stronghold, and Limerick was full of forests. In Kerry, besides Glenna Jeanty, where Desmond was killed, there was Glenflesk near Killarney, and indeed the whole county is evidently suited for guerrilla warfare. Sir Nicholas Browne reported in 1597 that Iragticonor, the country of O'Connor, Kerry was wedged in between his deadly enemies, Lord Fitzmaurice and the Knight of Glyn. His country is but small, and he is not able to make above 70 men, but by reason of his woods and bogs he was wont to hold his own in spite of them both. But of all the Munster strongholds none was so famous as the Glen of Atherlow in Tipperary. Who knows not Arlo Hill, says Spenser, applying the name of the vale to the lofty peak of Galtymore, which overshadows it. The poet had much to tell of a mythical golden age in those wilds, but a curse had come upon them, and in his time, he says, those woods and all that goodly chase doth to this day with wolves and thieves abound, which do too true that land's indwellers since have found. Inseparably connected as it was with his memory, the Glen of Arlow caused Spenser's ruin, for from it Owen, MacRory, and Tyrrell issued forth to destroy the Undertakers and all their works. Fighting in Ireland was the serious business of life, but soldiers, officials, and settlers found some time for amusement also. Irish hawks, hounds, and horses were all thought worthy to be sent as presents to great men in England, and hawks were often made the subject of treaties with Irish chiefs. Falconry, no doubt, was practised in Ireland, but we hear much more of hunting, and the game was plentiful. Irish wolfhounds were famous, and were considered handsome presents. The great Mogul Jahangir, being glad to accept some of in 1615, Perrott sent a brace, one black and the other white, to Walsingham. This great white dog, said Sir S. Bagenal, when sending one to Cecil, is the most furious beast that ever I saw. These hounds were of great size, but doctors differ as to their points, and it is not even certain whether they had rough or smooth coats. A modern club, which has tried to restore the breed, lays down that the Irish wolfhound should be not quite so heavy or massive as the Great Dane, but more so than the deerhound, which in general type he should otherwise resemble. Red deer abounded all over the country, and martens, now almost extinct, were so plentiful that the Earl of Ossory, in Henry VIII's time, kept a pack of hounds for them alone. As many as 12 dozen marten skins could sometimes be sent as a present, and even Strafford hoped to get enough to line a gown for Archbishop Laud. The ambling nags, called hobbies, were also much valued in England. Wolves were very common, and neither they nor the hounds which pursued them died out until the 18th century. Wildfowl, of course, abounded, and Morrison says he had seen 60 pheasants served at one feast, but partridges were scarce. Magpies seem to have been introduced late in the 17th century. About the towns and in the parts settled by Englishmen, tillage was carried on as in England. Many of the Irish chiefs also encouraged corn growing, and in time of war the soldiers were much occupied in destroying these crops. No doubt the husbandry was rude, as it long continued to be, and the barbarous custom of ploughing by the tail was restrained by order in council in 1606, but was still practised in remote places as late as Charles II's reign, when it was prohibited by Act of Parliament. The custom of burning oats from the straw, and so making cakes without threshing, was equally long-lived, and had also to be restrained by authority. But the chief wealth of the Irish was in their cattle, and the following statement of Morrison is sustained by innumerable letters. Ireland, after much blood spilt in the civil wars, became less populous, and as all well-great lords of counties and other inferior gentlemen laboured more to get new possessions for inheritance than by husbandry and peopling their old lands to increase their revenues, so, as I then observed, much grass, with which the island so much abounds, to have perished without use, and either to have rotted or in the next springtime to be burned, lest it should hinder the coming of new grass. This plenty of grass makes the Irish have infinite multitudes of cattle, and in the late rebellion Tyrones, the very vagabond rebels, had great multitude of cows, which they still, like the nomads, drove with them whithersoever themselves were driven, and fought for them as for their altars and families. By this abundance of cattle the Irish have a frequent, though somewhat poor, traffic for their hides, the cattle being in general very small, and only the men and the greyhounds of great stature. Neither can the cattle possibly be great, since they eat only by day, and then are brought at evening within the brawns of castles, where they stand or lie all night in a dirty yard, without so much as a lock of hay, whereof they make little for sluggishness, and that little they altogether keep for their horses. And they are thus brought in by night for fear of thieves, the Irish using almost no other kind of theft, or else for fear of wolves, the destruction whereof being much neglected by the inhabitants, oppressed by greater mischiefs. They are so much grown in numbers, and sometimes in winter nights they will come to prey in villages and the suburbs of cities. The wild Irish feed mostly on white meats, and esteem for a great dainty sour curds, vulgarly called by them bonny clabber, and for this cause they watchfully keep their cows, and fight for them as for religion and life. And when they are almost starved, yet they will not kill a cow, except it be old and yield no milk. Yet will they, upon hunger in time of war, open a vein of a cow and drink the blood, but in no case kill or much weaken it. Sir Nicholas White has recorded that the first red cattle were brought to Dingle from Cornwall, and it is probably from the cross between these red Devon and or Cornish beasts and the black cattle of the country that the famous Kerry breed is descended. The butter commonly made in Ireland in the 16th century is described as very bad. G.U.G. Ardini says the Irish exported hides, fur, and coarse linens and woolens to Antwerp. The consumption of wine was great, and for this the chief article sent in exchange was fish. In 1553 Philip II agreed to pay £1,000 a year for 21 years to gain for his subjects the right to fish on the Irish coast. Fishermen of all nations resorted to Baronhaven, paying O'Sullivan Bear for leave. In the north O'Donnell was called the King of Fish, and he owned the Salmon Leap at Ballyshannon. A Norse writer older than the Tudor period had already noted that Loch Lurn contained salmon enough to feed all the people in Ireland. The fisheries of the Bann and Foyle were also of great importance, and Spencer says that both the Suir and the Barrow were full of salmon. As to sea fish, we hear more of foreign than of native vessels. The few port towns certainly produce good sailors, and among native clans the O'Driscolls, the O'Flahertys, and the O'Malleys love the sea. About the famous sea Amazon, Grace O'Malley, many legends have been preserved, but of her and of all the other Celtic rovers it may be said that they were rather pirates than peaceful traders or fishermen. The only Irish manufacture of much importance was that of woolens, though frequent attempts were made to introduce others. Linen was made to a limited extent, and furnished the material for the enormous shirts, 30 or 40 ells in a shirt, all gathered and wrinkled and washed in saffron, because they never put them off till they were worn out, which fashion died out with the 16th century, but flax continued to be grown and yarn exported chiefly from Ulster, and it was upon this foundation that Stratford built. Irish frieze and other coarse woolens had been famous in the Middle Ages. Drugget is said by French antiquaries to have been so called from Drogheda. In the 16th century, Ireland had come to be specially famous for a kind of rug, of which Morrison says the best were made at Waterford. They were thought worthy of kings' houses, and Vice-Chamberlain Heneage asked Sir George Carew to provide half a dozen of the finest and lightest Irish rugs to lay upon beds that can be gotten. The little sheep of the country were numerous, but it is agreed that the wool was coarse. The making of the rugs was a craft in itself, and was probably known to few. Petty, who wrote under Charles II, remarks that the rebellion had injured the cloth trade, and the making of excellent thick, spongy, warm coverlets was a lost art. In Elizabeth's time, restraints were placed on the export of wool, with a view to encourage manufactures, but the prohibition was never really effective. Hard drinking was but too common, and the materials were abundant. The trade in claret had gone on from the time when Gascony belonged to the kings of England, but sherry and other strong vintages of the peninsula were even more popular. When they come to any market town, says Morrison, to sell a cow or a horse, they never return home till they have drunk the price in Spanish wine, which they call the King of Spain's daughter, or in Irish usque bog, until they have outslept 2 or 3 days' drunkenness. And not only the common sort, but even the lords and their wives, the more they want this drink at home, the more they swallow it when they come to it, till they be as drunk as beggars. Usque bog, that is, whiskey, was made in many places in the primitive fashion followed by illicit distillers in our own time. It was generally considered more wholesome than any spirit produced in England, and the damp climate was made the excuse for excessive indulgence. Raisins and fennel seeds were used to flavour it. An Act of Parliament passed in 1556 recites that aqua vitae, a drink nothing profitable to be daily drunken and used, is now universally throughout this realm of Ireland made, and especially in the borders of the Irishry, and for the furniture of Irish men, and thereby much corn, grain, and other things are consumed, spent, and wasted, and its manufacture was prohibited except with the Lord Deputy's license. A fine of £4 and imprisonment during pleasure were the prescribed penalties for each offence, but peers, landowners worth £10 a year, and freemen of cities and boroughs were allowed to make enough for their own use, and the act was probably a dead letter. Bodley, who wrote in 1603, tells us that it was usual for lay and cleric, churl and noble, in short, men and women of every rank, to pour usque bog down their throats by day and by night, and that not for hilarity only, which would be praiseworthy, but for constant drunkenness, which is detestable. Beer made of malt and hops were not yet brewed in Ireland, and what the soldiers consumed was imported, but strong ale was produced in the country and was probably preferred by the people, for hops were not in general use even in 1690. Early in James I's reign, Nothing struck an Englishman more than the number of alehouses in Dublin. "I'm now," says one, "to speak of a certain kind of commodity that outstretcheth all that I have hitherto spoken of, and that is the selling of ale in Dublin, a quotidian commodity that hath vent in every house in the town every day in the week, at every hour in the day, and in every minute in the hour. There is no merchandise so vendible. It is the very marrow of the commonwealth in Dublin. The whole profit of the town stands upon alehouses and selling of ale. The people," says Dimmock, "are of nature very glorious, frank, ireful, good horsemen, able to endure great pains, delighted in war, great hospitality, of religion for the most part papists, great gluttons, and of a sensual and vicious life, deep dissemblers, secret in displeasure, of a cruel revenging mind, and irreconcilable. Of wit they are quick and capable, kind-hearted where they take, and of exceeding love towards their foster brethren. Of complexion they are clear and well favoured, both men and women, tall and corpulent bodies, and of themselves careless and bestial. This is very much the view taken by English travellers generally, and in many points they are confirmed by the Spaniard Queller. Mountjoy complains of the want of clean linen, and his secretary has much to say on that subject. Many of the English Irish, he tells us, have by little and little been infected with the Irish filthiness, and that in very cities, excepting Dublin, and some of the better sort in Waterford, where the English continually lodging in their houses, they more retain the English diet. In cities passengers may have feather beds, soft and good, but most commonly lousy, especially in the highways, whether that come by their being forced to lodge common soldiers, or from the nasty filthiness of the nation in general. For even in the best city, as at Cork, I have observed that my own and other Englishmen's chambers, hired of the citizens, were scarce swept once in the week, and the dust laid in a corner was perhaps cast out once in a month or two. I did never see any public inns with signs hanged out among the English or English-Irish, but the officers of cities and villages appoint lodgings to the passengers, and perhaps in each city they shall find one or two houses where they will dress meat, and these be commonly houses of Englishmen, seldom of the Irish. So as these houses having no sign hung out, a passenger cannot challenge the right to be entertained in them, but must have it of courtesy and by entreaty. Some of our carriage horses falling into the wild Irish hands, when they found soap or starch carried for the use of our laundresses, they did eat them greedily, and when they stuck in their teeth, cursed bitterly the gluttony of us English churls, for so they term us." And Andrew Trollope, an English lawyer, who wrote with more force than politeness, says the Irish, except in the walled towns, were almost savages, and that at night Mr. or Mrs. or Dame, men servants, maid servants, women servants, I should have said, for I think there be no maids, guests, strangers, and all, lie in one little room, not so good or handsome as many a hogscote in England, and when they rise in the morning they shake their ears and go their ways, without any serving of God, or other making of them a ready. On arriving in Dublin, he says, I lodged in a lawyer's house, a man of my own profession, where I found my entertainment better than my welcome, as all Englishmen shall do. The gallows-glasses, with their axes and their quern, with their darts, became gradually obsolete during the Elizabethan period, pikemen taking the place of the former and musketeers of the latter. Tyrone taught his men the use of firearms, and they became better shots than the English. The difficulty of recruiting in England was great, and deserters were habitually replaced by Irishmen, who often passed over to their countrymen, arms and all. When Tyrone was loyal, he was allowed a certain number of men in the Queen's pay, and these frequently changed so as to increase the number of trained soldiers about him, thus anticipating on a small scale the famous expedient of Scharnhorst. From Spain there was a constant supply of arms, and the merchants in corporate towns made no difficulty about selling contraband of war to rebels, with whom they had religious sympathies. Deserters sold their matchlocks, and they were resold to the Irish. Even officers were accused of selling powder, nor were English ports closed to such good customers. I dare not trust any Chesterman, said the mayor of that town, and Liverpool turned on honest penny in the same way. Powder could not be made in Ulster, for there was no sulphur, but it was imported even from Danzig. There was also a constant supply of ammunition from Scotland, and Fenton proposed that the Queen should employ factors to buy up all the powder at Glasgow and Ayr, which could only have made the trade more lucrative. Tyrone fed his men on oatmeal and butter, which was exacted, according to certain rules, from the people on whom they were billeted. The pay was at the rate of 24 shillings a quarter, and when money was scarce, the deficiency was made up in milk. If a prisoner was ransomed, his captor had 1/3 of the amount, and the rest went to the chief. Mountjoy believed that Tyrone raised a revenue of more than £80,000 a year in Ulster. In Ireland, says Morrison, who spoke from actual observation, the English and the English-Irish are attired after the English manner for the most part, yet not with such pride and inconstancy, perhaps for want of means. Yet the English-Irish, forgetting their own country, are somewhat infected with the Irish rudeness, and with them are delighted in simple light colours, as red and yellow. And in like sort the degenerated citizens are somewhat infected with the Irish filthiness, as well in lousy beds, foul sheets, and all linen, as in many other particulars, but as well in diet and apparel. The citizens of Dublin, almost of all other, and the citizens of Waterford and Galway, in some good measure retain the English cleanliness. Touching the mere or wild Irish, it may be truly said of them, which of old was spoken of the Germans, that they wander slovenly and naked, and lodge in the same house, if it may be called a house, with their beasts. Among them the gentlemen or lords of countries wear close breeches and stockings of the same piece of cloth, of red or such light colour, and a loose coat, and a cloak or 3-cornered mantle, commonly of coarse light stuff made at home, and their linen is coarse and slovenly. I say slovenly because they seldom put off a shirt till it be worn, and these shirts in our memory before the last rebellion were made of some 20 or 30 ells, folded in wrinkles and coloured with saffron to avoid lousiness, incident to the wearing of foul linen. Their wives living among the English are attired in a sluttish gown to be fastened at the breast with a lace, and in a more sluttish mantle and more sluttish linen, and their heads be covered after the Turkish manner with many ells of linen. Only the Turkish heads or turbans are round in the top, but the attire of the Irish women heads is more flat in the top and broader on the sides, not much unlike a cheese mott, if it had a hole to put in the head. Morrison also mentions the loose mantles worn by both men and women, often as an excuse for wearing nothing else, which Spencer, who is very eloquent on the subject, calls a fit house for an outlaw, a meet bed for a rebel, and an apt cloak for a thief. The shock-heads of curled hair, called glibs, also excited the poet's wrath, being as fit masks as a mantle is for a thief. For whensoever he hath run himself into that peril of law that he will not be known, he either cutteth of his glib quite, by which he becometh nothing like himself, or putteth it so low down over his eyes that it is very hard to discern his thievish countenance. In a contemporary drawing of Turlough Nietzsche's Submission to Sidney, all his followers are represented with glibs, and it became a matter of treaty with Tyrone that he should allow none of his people to wear them. As the tribal age passed away, Irish and Anglo-Irish chiefs became more civilized. Among the native nobility of the house of Clanrickarde had been remarkable for lawlessness. But Earl Richard, who succeeded in 1601, not only distinguished himself as Kinsale, but also made a great figure at court. The affairs of Ireland, said the French ambassador, prosper so that not a single rebel keeps the field. I believe that this prosperous condition of things proceeds from the favour which that Irish earl enjoys here. On the other hand, he is very cold by nature, and in his love, and has neither understanding nor conduct to lift himself high, although there is no lack of counsel and support to him. Flatterers of the court to curry favour say that he resembles Essex. On the other hand, the Queen declares, with equal dissimulation, that she cannot love him, inasmuch as he recalls her sorrow for the Earl. And this contest occupies the entire court. Clanricarde, who is described by another contemporary as a goodly, personable gentleman, something resembling the late Earl of Essex, spent lavishly but paid honestly. The gossips at first coupled his name with that of Lady Strange, but in the autumn of 1602 he married Frances Walsingham, widow of the unfortunate favourite whom he was thought to resemble, and of Sir Philip Sidney. In 1604 Sir John Davies saw the Earl and Countess living together at Athlone in most honourable fashion, and reported that she was very well contented, and every way as well served as ever he saw her in England. Spenser and every other Englishman condemned the Irish bards as stirrers of sedition and preservers of barbarism. They were often very highly paid, and were feared as well as admired, for they knew how to satirize their hosts, and where the cheer was not abundant or to their liking. The bagpipe was commonly used in the field, and harps became scarce towards the close of the 16th century, so that in 1588 Maguire said he hardly knew of a good one in his country. It sometimes formed part of the furniture of a gentleman's house, the portion of a bride, in Tipperary being sworn, 2 as 80 cows, 24 mares, 5 horses, and a pair of playing tables, backgammon probably, and a harp besides household stuff. Professional card-players called caros abounded, and Campion says they would play away their clothes, and then, wrapping themselves in straw, would stake their glibs or bits of their flesh against any chance-comer's money. Captain Bodley tells how certain Irish gentlemen came masquerading to the officers' quarters at Downpatrick, asking to be allowed to play. These prudent gamblers brought 10 pounds of the new debased currency wrapped up in dirty pocket handkerchiefs, and their hosts sent them empty away at 2 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes higher stakes were played for than a few pounds of copper, and there is a tradition that Kilbritain Castle was lost by Lord Councey to McCarthy Riach, who only risked a white weasel or ferret. Tobacco was still too dear to be generally used in Ireland, but English officers could enjoy this consolation. We have seen that one was killed in the retreat from the Blackwater while indulging in a pipe by the roadside. Carew was a smoker, and both Raleigh and Cecil were among those who kept him supplied with tobacco. Captain Bodley, to whom we owe so many interesting details, is most eloquent on this subject, and will not allow that the enemies of tobacco have any reason on their side. Almost all, he says, have but one argument that would make a dog laugh, and a horse burst his halter, saying that neither our sires or grandsires took tobacco, yet lived I know not how long. Indeed, they lived till they died without tobacco. But who knows whether they would not have lived longer had they used it? And if a smoker now dies of any disease, who knows if he might not have died sooner had he abstained from it? Irish warfare was full of misery, but garrison life had its pleasures, such as they were. Captain Bodley has left an account of a week's visit paid in January 1603 to Sir Richard Morrison, the historian's brother, who was in command of Downpatrick. At Newry they found only lean beef, scarcely any mutton, very bad wine, and no bread, biscuit being used even in the governor's house. Bodley, with Captains Caulfield and Jeffson, halted at Magennis's house at Castlewellan, which he calls an island. They were entertained by Lady Sarah Magennis, Tyrone's daughter, and a very beautiful woman, and the 3 hours' halt seemed to pass in 1 minute. We drank ale and whiskey with our hostess, and having all kissed her in turn, took the road again. At Downpatrick the visitors were well treated, and their horses attended to, but they all occupied one bedroom. They washed before dinner, all in the same silver basin, and seemingly had but one towel, and this was done in the dining-room. Healths were drunk from a glass goblet of claret nearly a foot in circumference, which went from hand to hand, and there was a good deal of conviviality, whiskey flowing freely as well as claret. The dishes mentioned are brawn, stuffed geese, venison pasties, the game pies, mince pies, and tarts, that is Bodley's word, made of beef, mutton, and veal. Besides drinking, there was smoking, dicing, and a kind of horseplay which has been called cockfighting in modern times. The Irish gentlemen who came in to gamble and lost their money wore long shirts decked with ivy leaves, dogskin masks, and paper roses, and tall paper caps with ivy wreaths. In the morning, ale or beer, with spices or toast, was taken to allay thirst, to steady the head, and to cool the liver, and pipes were smoked before breakfast. The life was rough enough, but Bodley wrote in Latin, and shows a knowledge of Latin authors, and he and his friends conversed learnedly about Roman history. Constant warfare and the absence of a university hindered the growth of a literary class in Ireland. Native chiefs were content to patronize bards who sang their achievements and annalists who recorded their genealogies. But the English language was just attaining its full stature, and men could not but feel a pleasure in writing it sometimes. Of letters and treatises describing the state of Ireland there is no lack, and many of them show considerable literary force. But the cultivation of letters for their own sake was scarcely to be looked for. Sir Geoffrey Fenton, who had translated many books from the French, including the French version of Guicciardini, appears to have given up such work after he became Secretary for Ireland. Nathaniel Baxter, a long-forgotten poet, seems to have produced something while teaching a school at Youghal. Ludovic Brisket, born in Italy or of an Italian mother, translated Italian books directly and not through the French. Brisket was an official, like most of the English then in Ireland, and at his house near Dublin we find the first germ of literary society. It was here that the Fairy Queen was promised by Spenser himself to a company consisting of Archbishop Long and of several lawyers and soldiers, among which Sir Thomas Norris was perhaps the most distinguished. Raleigh, who visited Spenser at Kilcolman in 1589, saw the early part of the poem before it appeared, and he encouraged the poet. At court, Spenser was befriended both by Raleigh and Sidney, and the poet seems to have thought that such kindness as he did receive from the Queen was owing to his intimacy with the latter, whose influence long outlived him. But Spenser was not a successful suitor, and he has left a bitter diatribe against the courtier's profession. He learned to look upon Ireland as his home, and to praise the country's natural beauties, while sighing for the peace and refinement of England. No doubt the woods and glens, with their wolves and robbers, furnished the poet with much of his imagery, if they did not suggest his great work. But it must be remembered that he was an undertaker, an official, as well as a writer. The lady whom he made so famous by his pen, and whom he married at Cork, was Elizabeth Boyle, Richard Boyle's cousin, and so connected with Secretary Fenton. Raleigh and the rest of his friends were engaged in forming estates, and his sympathies were necessarily with the settlers and not with the natives. He tries to raise the Irish rivers to a level with those of England. Sith no less famous than the rest they be, and join in neighbourhood of kingdom near, why should they not likewise in love agree? But he can never forget that the woods upon their banks were haunted by men who wished him only death and destruction. He felt the weakness of his own position, and so was ready to praise Arthegall, or any other whose severity might make the land reasonably safe. If the readers of Spenser's verses, and still more of his treatises, find fault with his truculence, they should forget that he was a poet, and remember that he was trying to improve forfeited lands. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of Ireland under the Tudors, Volume 3, by Richard Bagwell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Church. Of 24 archbishoprics and bishoprics existing in Ireland at the date of Queen Elizabeth's death, 19 were filled by her nominees. In Ulster, Dromore, Derry, and Raphoe were left vacant on account of the wars, and the custody of Kilmore was given to a Dublin clergyman without episcopal rank, the papal bishop remaining in actual possession. Eugene O'Hart, one of the Tridentine Fathers, was made Bishop of Achornry in Connacht by papal provision in 1562, and he died at the age of 100 in the same year as the Queen, without being troubled by any Protestant rival. It is said, indeed, that Bishop O'Connor of Killaloe was appointed by the Queen to administer her Heart's See in 1591, but that he compounded with his old friend for £120 a year. In the greater number of sees there were papal bishops, but not in all, and in some cases they were practically mere bishops in partibus, with no more real power over their flock than de Retz had over the people of Corinth. Matthew de Oviedo was Archbishop of Dublin, but probably never saw his diocese, and Peter Lombard does not seem to have been at Armagh. Ribera, the Spanish Franciscan, who was Bishop of Leighlin from 1587 to 1604, is believed never to have visited Ireland at all, but the succession was maintained, and vicars were appointed when sees lay vacant or when bishops were absent. In Sir William Fitzwilliam's time there was not one serviceable church from Dublin to the farthest end of Munster, except in the poor towns, and the plain-spoken English lawyer Andrew Trollope has furnished many details. Out of 30 bishops, not 7 were able to preach, and the practice of alienating property was so rife that all the sees in Ireland would not be able to support one man worthy of his calling. The common secular clergy were mere stipendiaries, few having £5 a year, and the majority not more than half that sum. In truth, Trollope adds, such they are as deserve not living or to live, for they will not be accounted ministers but priests. They will have no wives. If they would stay there, it were well. But they will have harlots, which they make believe that it is no sin to live, and lie with them, and bear them children. But if they marry them, they are damned, and with long experience and some extraordinary trial of these fellows, I cannot find whether the most of them love lewd women, cards, dice, or drink best. And when they must of necessity go to church, they carry with them a book in Latin of the common prayer, set forth and aloud by Her Majesty. But they read little or nothing of it, or can well read it, but they tell the people a tale of Our Lady or St. Patrick or some other saint horrible to be spoken or heard, and intolerable to be suffered, and do all they may to allure the people from God and their prince, and their due obedience to them both, and persuade them to the devil and the Pope. And sure the people so much hear them, believe them, and are led by them, and have so little instruction to the contrary, as here is in effect a general revolt from God and true religion, our Prince and Her Highness's laws. Whatever disorders, says Spencer, you see in the Church of England, ye may find in Ireland, and many more, namely gross simony, greedy covetousness, fleshly incontinency, careless sloth, and generally all disordered life in the common clergymen. Priests of Irish blood behaved like laymen, neither reading, preaching, nor celebrating the communion, and christening after the popish fashion. They were diligent only in collecting tithes and dues. When the bishops were Irishmen, their government was lax and very often corrupt. English candidates for livings they rejected whenever they could, and the reason was generally available, since such aspirants were mostly either unlearned or men of the same bad note for which they had forsaken England. In the wilder districts the livings were so miserable that an English minister could scarcely support himself, and so dangerous that no man of peace could venture to reside. Where the benefices were somewhat fat, the incumbents, having the livings of the country offered unto them without pains and without peril, will neither for the same, nor any love of God, nor zeal of religion, nor for all the good they may do, winning souls to God, be drawn forth. Meantime, Jesuits and friars came continually from France, Italy, and Spain, by long toil and dangerous travelling thither, where they no peril of death awaiteth them, and no reward or riches is to be found, only to draw the people unto the Church of Rome. Most of the churches were utterly ruined, and some were so unhandsomely patched and thatched as to repel worshippers by their mere ugliness. Carelessness and stinginess were to blame, but the mischief was unwittingly increased by the Puritans, our late too nice fools who say there is nothing in the seemly form and comely order of the Church. Spencer proposed that there should be a strict law strictly enforced against sending young men to Rheims, Douai, Louvain, and such places, whose private persuasions do more hurt than the clergy can do good with their public instructions. English ministers, neat churches with proper churchwardens, and efficient schools might follow, but he was not sanguine, for what good should any English minister do among them by teaching or preaching to them which either cannot understand him or will not hear him? The energy of the Jesuits and friars in Ireland was one sign of a revival in the Church of Rome, no longer the Church of the Borgias or even of the Medici, but of Loyola and Contarini, of St. Carlo Borromeo and St. Vincent de Paul. Fasts were more strictly observed, and it became more and more difficult to secure even occasional and outward conformity to the state church. In the early years of the Queen's reign, the inhabitants of the towns generally attended service, but the women wearied and were not punished. When the Tyrone War began, even mayors, portreves, and other local officials had given up their attendance, and most of the children were christened in private houses. The Jesuits had schools in nearly all the towns, and young men resorted in great numbers to foreign seminaries. Priests and friars swarmed everywhere, especially at Waterford, and were sheltered by householders under whose roofs they sometimes preached quite openly. And the steady influence of these priests was directed of making Ireland dependent on foreign aid. Cornelius Ryan, papal bishop of Killaloe, advised O'Rourke to get some learned Irishman to write to the Pope, begging him to separate Ireland from England for ever and to make Tyrone king. The Jesuit Dominic O'Callaghan confessed that the designs of Rome and Spain extended even further than this, Philip intending with his army to overrun Ireland and to make that realm his ladder or bridge into England. The questions of religious belief and of civil allegiance are inextricably connected at this period, and it is impossible for us, as it was for Elizabeth, to treat them as really separate. Waterford was by all accounts the greatest resort of priests and friars. Miller McGrath was too busy jobbing to take much notice, and he held the see from 1582 to 1589, and again from 1592 to 1608. But Marmaduke Middleton, who was Bishop of Waterford from 1579 to 1582, took his trust seriously and found life uncomfortable in proportion. The marriage ceremony was scarcely thought necessary. Beads were publicly used, and prayers offered for the dead, nor did Middleton dare, for fear of a tumult, to remove images from the churches. There is, he says, no difference between the clergy and the laity here, for they have joined together to prevent Her Majesty's most godly proceedings, both by defacing of the see, which is not annually at this instant worth £30 a year, and all the spiritual living in temporal men's hands so surely linked that they cannot be redeemed, and the most of the incumbents are little better than wood kern. Middleton's life was thought to be in danger, and he was translated to St. David's. He succeeded in preventing the succession from falling to the dean, David Clare, who had thwarted him in every way, and whom Pelham wished to deprive even of that which he had. The deanery, however, remained with Clare, who was well friended as none better in this world than the wicked, and McGrath and his help in despoiling the Church of Waterford. The united diocese of Cork, Cloyne, and Ross fared, according to Bramhall, the best of any bishopric in that province, a very good man, Bishop Lyon, being placed there early in the Reformation. In 1595 he had had 13 years' experience, and he gave a most lamentable account of his stewardship. There was, he said, no knowledge of God's truth, and no obedience to magistrates, but false teachers drew men away to the palpable and damnable blindness to obey Her Majesty's capital and mortal enemy, that Antichrist of Rome. priests swore men to the Pope, charging a fee of 1 shilling and 6 pence for every Mass afterwards. The same priests baptized the children quietly, and it was scarcely possible to get sponsors for a legal christening. One poor clerk, his wife, and a poor minister, acting as universal gossips. Recusants had special orders not to argue with any Protestant. Lyon says that at one time he would have a congregation of 1,000 when he preached, but that now he had not 5, while communicants had dwindled from 500 to 3. The country was full of friars who were in all things obedient to Bishop Gallagher, the legate, while there was not a Protestant in the province who could preach in Irish. The devil's service was the best of the many names popularly applied to the Anglican ritual, and the natives crossed themselves when the Protestants passed, as if they were indeed devils. Lyon built himself a house at Ross, which was burned down by the O'Donovans, but he did what he could. Churches were restored, Bibles and prayer books were provided in English and Latin, but the congregations would not be tempted. Oaths to the Pope were freely taken, binding men to disobey the Act of Uniformity, and other oaths could not be believed. Owen McKeegan, who was sometimes called Bishop of Ross, had the power of a vicar apostolic and confirmed children in crowds. These wicked priests, says Lyon, are the sowers of rebellion in this kingdom, and will do mischief if they be not looked unto in time. I have lived here 25 years and been bishop 15 years, and I've observed their doings. I never saw them so badly minded as they be now in general, for it is a general revolt throughout the whole kingdom. They have had reins of liberty let loose unto them, and have not been kept under, whereas they are a people which, feeling the rigor of justice, are a good people in their kind, and with due justice and correction, but not oppressed, extorted, and unjustly dealt withal. They will be dutiful and obedient, but let them have favour and be well entreated. They will wax proud, stubborn, disobedient, disloyal, and rebellious. This I know by experience. Also the priests of the country have forsaken their benefices to become massing priests, because they are so well entreated and made so much of among the people. Many have forsaken their benefices by the persuasion of those seminaries that come from beyond the seas. They have a new mischief in hand, if it be not prevented. Owen McKeegan, who was killed near Kinsale in 1602, was generally called Vicar Apostolic and sometimes Bishop of Ross. He was believed by Carew to have all the patronage of Munster. He had great influence in Spain, but in Munster John Creagh, Bishop of Cork and Cloyne, was really a much more important person. He did not appear in public places where Englishmen were present, but exercised all manner of spiritual jurisdictions in the whole province, being the Pope's legate, consecrating churches, making priests, confirming children, deciding matrimony causes, one of the most dangerous fellows that ever came to that land. Continued longest there of any of his sort, who has done more harm in 2 years than Sanders did in his time, who could procure the coming of the Spaniards only, but this Creagh draweth the whole country in general to disloyalty and breaking of the laws. Creagh, or McGrath, for the name is written both ways, was the Archbishop of Cashel's cousin, and Myler took care to warn him of any danger, while pretending to give information to the government. In November 1600, he was with the Sugain Earl, and actually fell into the hands of Carew's soldiers, but they did not recognize him, being clothed in a simple mantle and torn trousers like an aged churl. He lived on into the next reign, and exercised a very wide jurisdiction, Lord Cahir and Lord Mountgarrett being much under his influence. Of nearly equal importance with Creagh was Redmond O'Gallagher, the titular Bishop of Derry, who befriended Captain Kelleher when he was cast away. O'Gallagher was one of the 3 Irish bishops who attended the Council of Trent. He had faculty to exercise jurisdiction in the whole province of Armagh during the frequent absences of Archbishop Creagh and perhaps of his successor MacGurran, and was busy throughout the All-Ulster, consecrating churches, ordaining priests, confirming children, giving all manner of dispensations, riding with pomp and company from place to place as it was accustomed in Queen Mary's days. He was killed in a skirmish or foray in 1601. Cornelius O'Devaney, titular Bishop of Down and Connor, is revered in Ireland as a martyr, but his death did not take place till 1612, when he had been 30 years bishop. It was reported in 1592 that Ulster contained 19 monasteries in which the friars and monks remained, using their habit and service as in Rome itself. From the translation of Loftus in 1567 to the end of the reign, there were 4 legal primates. The Cathedral of Armagh had been wrecked by Shane O'Neill, and the ruins of the city could scarcely be held even by a garrison, so that the archbishops generally lived at Termon Feckin. Primate Lancaster was anxious to found a grammar school in the neighbouring town of Drogheda, and offered to leave out of my transitory trifles £600 for the performance of the same, but he seems to have died without carrying out this design, and his successor Dr. Long is better remembered for having wasted the property of his see than for any benefit to it. But Long was not a pluralist like his predecessor, and it may be urged in extenuation that he died £1,000 in debt. He was succeeded by John Garvey, a Kilkenny man with an Oxford degree who spoke Irish and who had earned a good name as Bishop of Kilmore. Garvey complained that Long had reduced the value of the see to £120 a year by granting leases for 99 years, that his houses at Termonfeckin and Drogheda were in ruins, and that 3 years' income would scarcely suffice to put a roof over his head. Garvey died in 1595, and his successor, Henry Usher, is most famous as one of the founders of Trinity College. The restoration of the cathedral and the provision of the residence at Armagh were reserved for Primate Hampden. Primate Long has left a lamentable account of the church in Perrot's time, while giving that deputy full credit for doing his best. But why, he says, should I name it a church, whereas there is scant a show of any congregation of the godly, either care of material or mystical temple, in which men are brought to that pass, as taking away their shape, they are worse than horse and mule that have no understanding. Becometh your honour to remember that subjects have souls as well as bodies, and how grievous it is to the Spirit of God to have them governed in body and neglected in soul. Oh, that your careful eyes did behold the abominations which, like impudent dogs, they are not ashamed before the King of Kings to commit, the smell whereof so annoyeth the heavens, that I fear the Lord sitting there, laugheth our counsel to scorn, which savours so much of our own wits, without the true fear of him, which is the beginning of wisdom. The clergy are like the people, nay, they have made the people like them, monstrum horrendum, inform ingens, cui lumen ademptum. Your godly Parliament in England hath somewhat, though not sufficiently, bridled the court of faculties, the corruption of the clergy, but in this poor island it sendeth old and young, clergy and laity, in a wild gallop to the devil. Many souls daily perish, whose cure are committed to boys and to open wolves. Is it possible to look for civil peace where there is no peace in conscience? Pitiful it is, and will be answered before the highest, to suffer his garden to waste wild for lack of trimming, and then to pull up his plants that might fructify by the root, by palpable ignorance to make traitors, and then by sword and law to shed their blood, who for lack of better teaching could never do better. A few months later, Long had the satisfaction of announcing that Owen O'Hart, Bishop of Achonry, by papal provision, and one of those who attended the Council of Trent, had resigned his see, prostrating himself before her Majesty, whom he beforehand had agreed to curse, and thoroughly persuaded that the man of sin sitteth in Rome under pretence of the seat of God. But O'Hart continued to act as bishop, paying hush money to his ostensible Protestant successor, and forming one of the 7 who in 1587 promulgated the Tridentine decrees throughout Ulster. It is a hard thing, says Long, to be thought of, that the land is not able to afford of the birth of the land 40 Christians which have the taste of the true service of God. And how then can they be true-hearted to her Majesty when they are severed from her? lurking papists were bolder than they had been, and threatened the state, and it would be too late to shut the stable door when the horse is stolen. Long is sometimes edifying and always forcible, but Usher accused him of alienating the sea lands and of making a seal which enabled him to do so without capitular consent. In the curious epitaph which he wrote for himself, Marla McGrath declares that he served England in the midst of a war for 50 years. He was born in Bemanoch, became a conventual Franciscan, and was first provided to the See of Down, of which the O'Neills withheld the temporalities, and from which he was ejected by Gregory XIII for heresy and many other crimes. One of these was probably matrimony. At all events, he was twice married, and had a large family of sons and daughters. Whether or not his conversion was sincere, and both opinions have been held, McGrath was no credit either to the church which he joined or to the church which he deserted, and was accused of secretly favouring. He indulged immoderately in whiskey, and he jobbed without the smallest compunction. In 1607, when he had been Archbishop of Cashel and Bishop of Emly for 36 years, the united diocese was found to be in a terrible state. Emly Cathedral was in ruins, and things were little better at Cashel. About 26 livings were held by his sons or other near relations, often in virtue of simoniacal contracts, and in nearly every case there was no provision for divine service. More than 20 livings and dignities were in the archbishop's own possession, who received the profits without order taken for the service of the church. No school whatever was provided. 19 livings or dignities were returned as void and destitute of incumbents, and in others, says the report, some poor men, priests, and others carry the name, but they have little learning or sufficiency, and indeed are fitter to keep hogs than to serve in the church. In the 2 dioceses there is not one preacher or good minister to teach the subjects their duties to God and His Majesty. McGrath had been Bishop of Waterford and Lismore for 20 years, and it will appear that wheresoever the Archbishop could do hurt to the Church, he hath not forborne to do it. 16 livings were returned as void and destitute of incumbents. Several others were bestowed upon absentees, who provided no curates, and the Archbishop's daughter or daughter-in-law enjoyed the income of 2 in which the churches were ruined and the cures not served. McGrath made many leases for his own profit, and with the connivance of the dean and chapter alienated the manor of sea lands of Lismore and the castle, which was the episcopal residence, to Sir Walter Raleigh for a rent of £13 6 shillings 8 pence in perpetuity. The capitular seal of Cashel he kept in his own hands and used as he pleased. The country clergy, says Davies, were idols and ciphers, and he adds with a fine irony that they cannot read if they should stand in need of the benefit of their clergy. Serving men and horse boys held benefices, and the court of faculties dispensed them from all duty, and for all their pluralities they were beggars, since the patron or ordinary took most of the profits by a plain contract before their institution. The agent or nuncio of the Pope, he says, hath £40 or £50 a year out of the profits of a parsonage within the pale. The churches were in ruins throughout the kingdom, and there was no divine service, no christening of children, no receiving of the sacrament, no Christian meeting or assembly, no, not once in the year. In a word, no more demonstration of religion than amongst Tartars or cannibals. The bishops were but too often partakers in the prevalent corruption, and Davies suggested that visitors should be sent from England, such as never heard a cow speak and understand not that language, a gift of cattle being the usual means of bribery in Ireland. Neither Loftus nor Jones were disinterested men, but they did take some pains to provide respectable incumbents, Englishmen for the most part, and Davies, who did not like either of them, reported that the Pale was not so universally Catholic as Sir Patrick Barnwall and some of others would affirm it to be. That was all he could say, and it was not much. Archbishop Loftus had prevented Perrott from turning his cathedral of St. Patrick's into a college, but he helped to provide the means from another source. In 1166, Dermot MacMurrough had founded the priory of All Hallows for Arosian canons just outside Dublin, and by a curious coincidence, the man who introduced the English into Ireland, thus unwittingly set apart the ground on which the most successful of Anglo-Irish institutions was destined to be built. In 1538 the priory was granted to the city of Dublin, and in 1590 the corporation were induced to offer the property, which was valued at £20 a year, as a site for the new college. In 1579 the Queen had entertained the idea of a university at Clonfert on account of its central position, for that renegades of the nation, which under pretence of study in the universities beyond the seas, do return freight with superstition and treason, and are the very instruments to stir up our subjects to rebellion. Nothing came of that plan, perhaps because the bishops were expected to provide the means of realizing it, and as there was no education to be had at home, the young gentlemen had continued to resort to universities where the Queen was considered an excommunicated heretic. The offer of the Dublin citizens was now accepted, and the monastic buildings, all but the steeple, were at once pulled down. Henry Usher, a native of Dublin, but a graduate of both of Oxford and Cambridge, who was afterwards primate, and who was at this time archdeacon, deserves credit for successfully carrying out the negotiations, and the charter recites that it was he who had petitioned the Queen in the name of the city to found the college. Loftus was first provost, Usher himself with 2 other fellows and 3 scholars being appointed in the same instrument. Burghley was the first chancellor, Essex the second, and Robert Cecil the third. After the siege of Kinsale, £1,800 was subscribed by the army for a library, which thus began at the same time as Bodley's, and the great collection of Archbishop James Usher was virtually secured by a subscription of £2,200 in Cromwell's army. Trinity College was founded as the mother of a university, but no second house was ever opened, and in common language the college and the university are treated as one and the same. From the first, Trinity College was under Protestant management and was intended to counteract the influence of the seminaries at Salamanca and other places abroad. And in Ireland, since the masses adhered to Rome, Protestantism has ever naturally tended to the Puritan rather than to the Anglican side. Loftus himself had been a friend of Cartwright. Dr. Travers, the second provost, is claimed by the Presbyterians, and he was certainly a strenuous opponent of Richard Hooker. James Fullerton and James Hamilton, the first elected fellows, were Scotchmen, and seem to have been educated at St. Andrews, under Andrew Melville, to whose opinions they may very probably have inclined. Fullerton and Hamilton, while enjoying some portion of Elizabeth's favour, were James VI's secret agents, and it is supposed that Cecil has sometimes sent through them letters which it might have been dangerous to trust to the ordinary channels. The 2 Scots kept their school in Ship Street, Dublin, and had the honour of teaching James Usher from his 9th to his 14th year. The first buildings were erected by public subscription, and some of the subscribers were Roman Catholics, but Archer the Jesuit was collecting about the same time for the Salamanca Seminary. The danger was understood from the first, and a petition to the Pope calls attention to a certain splendid college near Dublin, the capital of Ireland, where the youths of Ireland are instructed in heresy by English teachers. In 1609, Trinity is officially called the Fanatics' College by the Irish Jesuits. Trinity College being out of the question, the Irish priesthood continued to be educated abroad, and O'Sullivan gives it a list of towns where they had seminaries of their own, or at least special facilities. At Salamanca, Compostela, and Lisbon, these institutions came into Jesuit hands, and there was a 4th at Seville. The Irish Franciscans had great privileges at Louvain, and there were Irish seminaries at Antwerp, Douay, and Tournai. Those who preferred the dominions of the most Christian of those to those of the most Catholic king might find classes ready to receive them at Bordeaux, Toulouse, and Paris. In 1624, the famous Roth and 4 other Irish prelates declared that the Parisian seminary had supplied many men distinguished in virtue, doctrine, and zeal for the work of the Church in Ireland. And so, says O'Sullivan, crowds of Irish priests inundate Ireland, some educated in convents, some in seminaries, and some at the expense of their parents, and they, partly, if not altogether, repair the damage which the English have done by upsetting the religious houses and seats of holy learning. The first book ever printed in Dublin was Edward VI's First Book of Common Prayer. It was printed by Humphrey Powell in 1551, professedly by St. Leger's command, and it contains a prayer for Sir James Croft. A copy is preserved in Trinity College, and Dr. Todd doubted if there were a second in existence. The only other known specimen of Powell's work is Sidney's book of the Articles, printed in 1566. Edward's second prayer book, says Dr. Ball, was never, either by statute or order, introduced, nor was it at all used in the Irish Church, but it forms the basis of that which, under Elizabeth, was authorized for Ireland. Orders were given that the prayer book of 1557 should be translated into Irish for use in places where English was not understood, but this was never done. It is probable that no competent translator could then be found, and certain that the means of printing did not yet exist. Queen Elizabeth afterwards provided a press and fount of Irish type, in hope that God in his mercy would raise up some to translate the New Testament into their mother tongue. In 1571, a catechism was produced by Nicholas Walsh, Chancellor, and John Kearney, Treasurer of St. Patrick's, both Cambridge men, and this is the first work printed in Irish. There is a copy in the Bodleian, and Dr. Cotton had never heard of any other. Walsh, who became Bishop of Ossory, obtained an order to publish a translation of the prayer book for use in country places. He also began an Irish version of the New Testament, and his fellow worker Kearney is said to have proceeded far in the work. It was reserved for William Daniel, Archbishop of Tuam, a Kilkenny man, and one of the original scholars of Trinity, to publish the New Testament in Irish, his predecessor, Archbishop Donnelly, having worked in the same field. Daniel's printer was John Frank. Whatever may have been done towards the translation of the Old Testament by Kearney, Daniel, and other scholars, the work was only completed by Bishop Bagwell, and his publication having been delayed by the outbreak of the rebellion in 1641, it did not appear until 1685. Elizabeth refused to dispense with penal laws against recusants, but she allowed a good deal of practical toleration, and Irish Catholics who did not engage in plots were not generally interfered with. I find by the court rolls, says a very learned lawyer and antiquary, that Queen Elizabeth had her high ecclesiastical commissioners who occasionally punished for not attending divine service, but this was rare. No more than 2 or 3 instances during her reign. Jones and Loftus were willing enough to interpret the laws strictly and to enforce them rigorously, but nearly all deputies disliked adding to their difficulties by strictness in religious matters, and Mountjoy in particular was much opposed to severity. Bacon alone seems to have thought legal toleration possible. His plan was to establish Anglicanism in Ireland, to respect liberty of conscience, and to tolerate the public exercise of the Roman ritual in certain places. This was what was done by the Edict of Nantes, following upon many other temporary measures to a like effect. It must, however, be remembered that Henry IV established the religion of the majority, while Cecil was advised to do the contrary. That in France the professors of both faiths were Frenchmen, while in Ireland the establishment would exist not only for the minority but also entirely for Englishmen who came in the guise of conquerors or supplanters of the native population, and that the Church of Rome aims at universal supremacy, which a Protestant church is not called upon to do. If, says Bacon, consciences be to be enforced at all, yet 2 things must precede their enforcement, the one means of instruction, the other time of operation, neither of which they have yet had. Besides, till they be more like reasonable men than they yet are, their society were rather scandalous to the true religion than otherwise, as pearls cast before swine. For till they be cleansed from their blood, incontinency, and theft, which are now not the lapses of particular persons but the very laws of the nation, they are incompatible with religion reformed. For policy there is no doubt, but to wrestle with them now is directly opposite to their reclaim, and cannot but continue their alienation of mind from this government. Besides, one of the principal pretenses whereby the heads of the rebellion have prevailed both with the people and with the foreigner hath been the defence of the Catholic religion, and it is this that likewise hath made the foreigner reciprocally more plausible with the rebel. Therefore a toleration of religion, for a time not definite, except it be in some principal towns and precincts, after the manner of some French edicts, seemeth to me to be a matter warrantable by religion, and in policy of absolute necessity, and the hesitation in this point, I think, has been a great casting back of the affairs there. Neither, if any English papist or recusant shall, for liberty of his conscience, transfer his person, family, and fortunes thither, do I hold it a matter of danger, but expedient to draw on undertaking and to further population. Neither, if Rome will cozen itself by conceiving it may be some degree to the like toleration in England, do I hold it a matter of any moment, but rather a good mean to draw off the fierceness and eagerness of Rome, and to stay further excommunications or interdictions for Ireland. But there would go hand in hand with this some course of advancing religion indeed, where the people is capable thereof, as the sending over some good preachers, especially of that sort which are vehement and zealous persuaders, and not scholastical, to be resident in principal towns, endowing them with some stipends out of her Majesty's revenues, as her Majesty hath most religiously and graciously done in Lancashire, and the continuing and replenishing the college begun at Dublin, the placing of good men to be bishops in the sees there, and the taking of the version of Bibles, catechisms, and other books of instruction into the Irish language, and the like religious courses, both for the honour of God and for the avoiding of scandal and insatisfaction, here by the show of a toleration of religion in some parts there. This passage and the whole of the letter containing it shows an extraordinary comprehension of the Irish difficulties, but some of the positive recommendations are open to question. It is not possible to provide vehement, zealous, and persuasive preachers in Ireland as in Lancashire, for the Lancashire people could be addressed in their own tongue, and the Irish could not. In Ireland the forces of oratory were entirely on the side of Rome. End of chapter 54. End of Ireland Under the Tudors, Volume 3, by Richard Bagwell.